Hello everyone, I am MANO Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Chugach National Forest in Alaska just last summer. I'd always been an avid hiker, but the events that unfolded during what was supposed to be a soul-searching solo trip have left me permanently changed, damaged in ways I can't fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. I had just gone through a difficult divorce after 8 years of marriage. My ex-husband, Mark, had been unfaithful, and the discovery had shattered my world. The legal proceedings dragged on for months, and by the time it was finalized, I felt hollow. My therapist suggested I reconnect with myself, find something that was purely Laura again. Hiking had always been my sanctuary before I met Mark, so I decided to plan a challenging solo trek through the Chugach Mountains. I chose a remote trail that would take me to Eklutna Lake and then deeper into the wilderness toward Bold Peak. It was a demanding route, but I was experienced and well prepared, or so I thought. I arrived at the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in late June. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of spruce and damp earth. The parking lot was nearly empty, just 2 other vehicles, both with Alaska plates. As I shouldered my pack and adjusted my trekking poles, I felt a flicker of anxiety, but I pushed it down. This was exactly what I needed: solitude, challenge, and reconnection with my own strength. The first day's hike was uneventful but beautiful. The trail wound through dense forest before opening to spectacular views of the mountains reflected in Eklutna Lake. I made good time and set up camp near Twin Peaks Trail Junction, about 8 miles in. As I prepared my freeze-dried meal on my compact stove, I felt the tension that had been my constant companion for months finally beginning to ease. That night, I slept soundly in my tent, lulled by the gentle rustling of leaves and distant murmur of a stream. I woke feeling refreshed, packed up efficiently, and continued toward Bold Peak, planning to make camp that night in a remote basin known for its stunning views. The second day's hike grew increasingly difficult as the trail climbed steeply. By early afternoon, I reached a high ridge that offered breathtaking vistas of the surrounding wilderness. Not another human in sight, just mountains, forests, and sky. I paused to catch my breath and take a few photos. That's when I first felt it, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite identify. The bird sounds seemed to have stopped. The air felt suddenly heavier, more oppressive. I scanned the horizon, looking for signs of incoming weather. Alaska's conditions could change rapidly, and I didn't want to be caught in a storm at this elevation. The sky remained clear, but the silence persisted. I took a long drink of water and continued hiking, trying to shake off the unease. By late afternoon, I'd descended into a beautiful basin surrounded by steep slopes. I found a perfect camping spot near a small alpine lake and set up my tent. As I was securing the rainfly, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, just a flicker at the tree line about 50 yards away. I straightened up and looked directly at the spot but saw nothing unusual. Just the dark green of spruce trees against the lighter vegetation of the alpine meadow. "Getting jumpy, Laura," I muttered to myself, but I couldn't fully dismiss the sensation of being watched. I prepared dinner as the sun began its long, slow descent toward the horizon. In June, Alaska enjoys nearly continuous daylight, but the quality of light changes, taking on a golden, then increasingly bluish cast as night approaches. I sat on a rock near my tent, eating my rehydrated chili and watching the shifting light paint the mountains in ever-changing colors. Then I heard it, a voice, distant, indistinct, but unmistakably human. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. No response. I set my meal down and stood, scanning the basin. I was alone, at least I appeared to be. Is someone there? I tried again, with the same result. I told myself it was just the wind, or water over rocks in the nearby stream, tricking my ears. Still, I found myself checking that my bear spray was easily accessible in my pack's side pocket. I also had a knife strapped to my belt, standard precautions for wilderness hiking, particularly in bear country. I finished my meal without tasting it and cleaned up meticulously, securing my food in the bear canister and placing it well away from my tent. The entire time I kept glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being observed. I crawled into my tent earlier than planned and zipped myself in, taking comfort in the flimsy nylon barrier between myself and whatever might be out there. I pulled out my journal and tried to focus on writing about the day's hike, the spectacular scenery, the physical challenge that had felt so grounding, but my words kept circling back to that moment on the ridge, that first perception of wrongness. Eventually, I put the journal away and turned off my headlamp. Despite the perpetual twilight filtering through the tent walls, I managed to fall into a fitful sleep. The sound that woke me was so faint I almost dismissed it, a whisper that seemed to come from just outside my tent. Laura. My eyes snapped open. For a moment, I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the thudding of my heart. Laura. We've been waiting. The voice was female, soft but raspy, as if unused for a long time. I sat bolt upright, fumbling for my headlamp. Who's there? I demanded, trying to sound authoritative despite the tremor in my voice. Silence answered me. I unzipped the tent door with shaking hands and peered out. The basin lay quiet under the strange half-light of the Alaskan summer night. Nothing moved. No one stood nearby. I zipped the tent closed again and grabbed my phone. No service, of course. I hadn't expected any out here, but I checked the time, 1:47 a.m. I considered packing up and hiking out immediately, but the thought of navigating the steep, unfamiliar trail in the dim light seemed more dangerous than staying put. I lay back down, clutching my bear spray, and somehow managed to doze off again. When I woke, sunlight was streaming through the tent walls. I felt momentarily disoriented. Then the events of the night came rushing back. In the brightness of morning, they seemed less threatening. A dream, perhaps, or my imagination working overtime in the isolation. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The basin looked peaceful, beautiful. A thin mist rose from the surface of the small lake, catching the morning light. I stretched, feeling my muscles protest after yesterday's climb. As I began my morning routine, filtering water, preparing breakfast, I almost managed to convince myself that nothing unusual had happened. Then I saw the footprints. They circled my tent, small, barefoot human prints pressed into the damp ground. They hadn't been there when I set up camp, and they came from the direction of the lake, not the trail. My appetite vanished. I packed up camp with record speed, my hands trembling so badly I struggled with the tent poles. Someone had been here, had been standing right outside my tent while I slept. Someone who knew my name. I shouldered my pack and headed back toward the trail, intent on hiking out as quickly as possible. As I passed the small alpine lake, I paused. There was something unnatural about its stillness. No ripples disturbed its surface despite the light breeze. I knelt at the edge and peered into the dark water. A face stared back at me from beneath the surface, pale, female, with long dark hair floating around it like seaweed. But it wasn't my reflection. The woman's eyes were open, fixed on mine. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I scrambled backward with a scream caught in my throat. When I looked again, heart pounding, there was nothing there, just the reflection of sky and mountains on the lake's surface. Fear propelled me up the trail faster than I'd ever hiked before. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I would see someone, or something, following me. But the trail behind remained empty. By midday, I'd reached the ridge where I'd first felt that sense of wrongness. I paused only long enough to catch my breath and take a swig from my water bottle. The silence that had disturbed me yesterday had been replaced by an unnatural cacophony. Birds calling in disjointed, frantic patterns, the wind moving through the trees with an almost human moan. "Just get back to the car," I told myself. "Just get out of here." I pushed on, descending toward Twin Peaks Junction where I'd spent my first night. The trail seemed different somehow. Narrower, the markers further apart. Several times I found myself stopping, uncertain, consulting my map and GPS to confirm I was still on the right path. At one point, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw a figure standing among the trees about 20 yards ahead. My step faltered. "Hello," I called cautiously. The figure didn't move. It appeared to be a woman in a dark jacket, her back to me. Long dark hair hanging down. "Are you okay?" I tried again. "Do you need help?" Still no response. I hesitated, then slowly continued forward, alert for any sudden movement. As I drew closer, the woman disappeared behind a large spruce tree. I approached warily, calling out again. When I reached the tree and looked around it, there was no one there. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign anyone had been there at all. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I was still miles from the trailhead, and the day was advancing. If I pushed hard, I might make it out before dark, but it would be close. I continued at a near jog wherever the trail allowed it, my pack bouncing uncomfortably against my back. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming taller, their shadows darker and more numerous than they should have been even with the afternoon sun. Then I heard it again, my name, whispered from somewhere amid the trees. "Laura, you can't leave yet." I broke into a run, heedless of the uneven trail. My foot caught on a root and I went down hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. For a moment, I lay there gasping, tears of pain and fear blurring my vision. As I pushed myself up, I noticed a small cairn of stones beside the trail that I didn't remember from my hike in. Balanced on top was a small object. I leaned closer and felt the blood drain from my face. It was a wedding ring. My wedding ring, which I'd removed months ago after the divorce was finalized and left in a jewelry box in my apartment in Anchorage. I snatched it up, my mind reeling. It was impossible. I examined it with trembling hands. The same white gold band, the same small diamond, the same inscription inside. "Forever yours, Mark." My legs nearly gave out beneath me. This couldn't be happening. I shoved the ring into my pocket and forced myself to stand, to keep moving. The trail switchbacked down toward Eklutna Lake. I recognized landmarks now. I was getting closer to the trailhead, just a few more miles. As I rounded a bend, I came to an abrupt halt. A woman stood in the middle of the trail about 30 feet ahead of me. This time, she faced me. She wore what looked like a simple dark dress, soaked through and clinging to her thin frame. Her long black hair hung in wet ropes around her pale face. Water pooled at her bare feet despite the dry trail. My mouth went dry. "Who are you?" I managed to ask. "What do you want?" Her eyes, dark, almost black, remained fixed on me. "You shouldn't be alone out here, Laura," she said, her voice the same raspy whisper I'd heard outside my tent. "No one should be alone in these mountains." "How do you know my name?" I demanded, fingers closing around the bear spray in my pocket. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed more curious than threatening. "The water told me. The mountains remember you, Laura. They remember everyone who passes through." I took a step backward. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" "Company," she said simply. "It's been so long since someone came to my lake, so long since I had someone to talk to." "Your lake?" I repeated, confused. "They named it after me. Agnes Lake. I've been there since 1912. I frowned. The small alpine lake where I'd camped wasn't called Agnes Lake on my map. "You're mistaken," I said. "That's not Agnes Lake." Her expression darkened. "They changed the name after what happened. They tried to forget me. She took a step toward me. But the water remembers. The mountains remember. I pulled out the bear spray, my finger on the trigger. Stay back. She stopped, her head tilting the other way now. You're afraid? You don't need to be afraid of me, Laura. I just want company. Her voice softened further. Don't you get lonely? After Mark left you? Hearing my ex-husband's name from this stranger's lips sent a chill down my spine. How do you know about Mark? The water shows me things. I saw you crying by the lake. I saw the ring you threw in. I hadn't thrown my ring in any lake. I'd taken it off in my apartment months ago, yet somehow it had appeared on the trail. I don't understand what's happening, I said, my voice breaking. Join me, she whispered. In the lake. It's peaceful there. No more pain, no more betrayal. Understanding dawned, horrifying and impossible. You drowned in that lake? Her smile was sad. My husband brought me here in 1912. We were pioneering, trying to build a life. But he found gold, and gold changes men. He found another woman in the mining camp. He brought me on a special trip to tell me. Her expression hardened. He held me under the water when I started screaming. Said it was an accident when he returned alone. I couldn't process what I was hearing. This woman, this apparition, was claiming to be a ghost, a spirit, something that had died over 100 years ago. You're not real, I said, more to convince myself than her. You can't be real. I'm as real as your pain, Laura. As real as Mark's betrayal. As real as the loneliness eating you from inside. She extended a pale, dripping hand. Come back to the lake with me. Stay with me. I raised the bear spray higher. No, I'm leaving. Now. Her face contorted with sudden rage, her features sharpening, eyes darkening until they were bottomless pits in her face. You can't leave me, she shrieked, the sound inhuman, echoing among the trees with unnatural resonance. She lunged forward with impossible speed. I squeezed the trigger on the bear spray, the powerful jet hitting her directly in the face. But instead of recoiling, she passed right through the cloud and through me. An unbearable cold seized me as if my blood had turned to ice. For a terrifying moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Images flashed through my mind, a small cabin by a lake, a man's angry face, water closing over my head, lungs burning, darkness, endless darkness, and then the lake, always the lake, years passing, decades, watching hikers come and go, reaching out, always reaching. Then it was over. I collapsed to my knees on the trail, gasping for air. When I looked around, the woman, Agnes, was gone. I struggled to my feet, still shaking violently from the cold that had penetrated to my bones. Without looking back, I continued down the trail as fast as my trembling legs would carry me. The remainder of the hike passed in a blur of terror and determination. Every shadow among the trees, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. Several times I thought I heard whispers following me, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. When I finally reached the Eklutna Lake shore, the sun was beginning its long, slow descent toward the western mountains. I still had a couple of miles to go to reach the trailhead, but being near the wider, well-traveled lakeshore path gave me a small measure of comfort. Then I saw her again, standing in the lake, water up to her waist, staring at me. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. I turned away and walked faster. When I glanced back, she was closer to shore, now only knee-deep in the water. Her expression had changed from rage to pleading, her arms outstretched toward me. Please, her voice carried across the water, please don't leave me alone. I broke into a run, following the lakeshore trail, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. I didn't look behind me again until I'd reached the final stretch before the parking lot. When I did, she was there, standing on the trail just yards behind me, water pooling around her bare feet, her dark eyes fixed on mine with desperate intensity. You'll come back, she said softly. "They always come back." "No," I said firmly, finding my voice at last. "I won't." Her expression darkened. "Then I'll find you. Wherever there's water, I can find you now." Before I could respond, she dissolved, literally fell apart into a cascade of water that splashed to the ground and then was gone, leaving only damp earth behind. I ran the rest of the way to the parking lot, fumbling for my car keys with numb fingers. As I drove back toward Anchorage, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a pale, wet face staring back at me. That night, in my apartment, I stood in the shower letting hot water sluice over me, trying to banish the bone-deep cold that had settled into me when Agnes passed through me. As steam filled the bathroom, I thought I heard a whisper beneath the sound of running water. I shut off the shower immediately and backed out of the bathroom, not stopping to dry off or grab a towel. Water pooled around my feet on the hardwood floor of my bedroom. In the fogged mirror, visible through the open bathroom door, I could see letters appearing as if traced by an invisible finger. "I found you." I moved out of that apartment the next day. I haven't been hiking since. I avoid swimming pools, lakes, even long baths. I take only the briefest showers, but sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake to the sound of dripping water, though all my taps are tight. And sometimes, in puddles after rain, or in the reflection in my morning coffee, I catch a glimpse of a pale face with dark, hungry eyes. I know now why that small alpine lake isn't named Agnes Lake on any modern maps. The name was changed after the accident. But the water remembers. The mountains remember. And Agnes is still waiting for company. My name is Robert Johnson, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the winter of 2023, in the remote wilderness of Rangel St. Elias National Park, Alaska. I've been an avid hiker for most of my adult life, but nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me and my friends in those mountains. It was supposed to be a chance to reconnect. The four of us, myself, Trevor Miller, Diane Hughes, and Marcus Patel, had been inseparable throughout college, but careers and relationships had slowly pulled us apart over the years. When Trevor suggested a week-long winter hiking expedition in Alaska, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to strengthen those old bonds. We were all reasonably experienced hikers, though none of us had tackled anything as challenging as the Alaskan wilderness in winter. "It'll be an adventure," Trevor had said during our planning video call, his enthusiasm infectious as always. Something to remind us we're still alive. If only he had known how prophetic those words would become. We arrived in Copper Center, a tiny settlement near the park, on a bitter January morning. The temperature was well below freezing, and the sun barely crested the horizon, giving us only a few precious hours of dim daylight. The locals at the ranger station gave us curious looks when we mentioned our destination: the Sanford River Valley and the mountains beyond, an area locally known as the Whispering Pines. "Folks don't usually head out there this time of year," the ranger, a weathered man named Bill Henley, told us as he reviewed our permits. His eyes lingered on our equipment. "You all seem prepared, but nature's different up here, unforgiving." "We've done our research," I assured him, though his concern sent a flicker of doubt through my mind. Bill nodded slowly. "Just be careful around Blackburn Peak. Strange things happen up there." "Strange how?" Marcus asked, always the curious one. The ranger's expression darkened. "Local legends. Nothing scientific." He handed back our papers. "Stay on your planned route, check in at your scheduled times, and respect the wilderness." As we turned to leave, he called after us. "And if you hear the pines whispering, don't listen." We laughed it off as local color, something to scare the tourists. By afternoon, we had left civilization behind, our heavy packs loaded with supplies as we trudged along the snow-covered trail. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not just quiet, but a profound absence of sound that seemed to swallow even our footsteps. The vast white landscape stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees and distant mountains. The first 2 days passed without incident. We established a rhythm, hiking during the brief daylight hours and setting up camp well before darkness fell. Despite the cold and physical exertion, spirits were high. Around the campfire, we reminisced about college days, shared stories of our current lives, and gradually found our old dynamic. It was on the 3rd day that things changed. We were making our way toward Blackburn Peak, following a route that would take us through a densely forested valley before beginning our ascent. The trees grew thicker here, ancient pines whose massive trunks disappeared into a canopy so dense it blocked much of the already feeble sunlight. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Diane asked as we stopped for water. Her breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air. "It's just the wilderness playing tricks on you," Trevor replied with a confident smile. "Happens to everyone out here." But I had felt it too, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like invisible eyes tracking our every move. I said nothing, not wanting to feed into the paranoia. As we continued hiking, the sensation only intensified. The forest seemed to close in around us, the spaces between trees shrinking until the path ahead was barely visible. The temperature dropped noticeably, and an unnatural stillness settled over the landscape. "Check your GPS, Trev," Marcus called from behind me. "I think we might be off course." Trevor pulled out his device and frowned. "That's weird. It's not getting a signal." "Mine either," Diane added, holding up her own GPS unit. I checked my phone, no service, which was expected, but the compass app was spinning wildly, the needle rotating in continuous circles. "Must be some kind of magnetic anomaly in the area," I suggested, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's use the physical maps." But as I pulled out the topographical map from my pack, my blood ran cold. The landmarks didn't match our surroundings. According to the map, we should have been approaching a clearing, but all around us stretched the same dense forest. "We must have taken a wrong turn," Marcus said, peering over my shoulder at the map. "Impossible," Trevor insisted. "We've been following the trail markers all morning." But when we looked back, the trail markers were gone. In every direction there was nothing but trees, identical towering pines whose branches swayed gently despite the complete absence of wind. And that's when I first heard it. A soft, barely perceptible sound that might have been the wind, except there was no wind. A whisper that seemed to come from the trees themselves, too faint to make out words but unmistakably there. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice unnaturally loud in the silence. The others looked at me with blank expressions. "Hear what?" Diane asked. I strained to listen, but the sound had stopped. "Nothing, just the wind, I guess." "There is no wind, Rob," Marcus pointed out, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We decided to make camp early that day, hoping to reorient ourselves in the morning. As I helped Trevor set up the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was different somehow. Not just that we were lost, but that the very nature of our surroundings had changed. The trees seemed closer than they had been moments before, their shadows stretching at impossible angles. That night, huddled around the campfire, no one spoke much. The usual camaraderie had been replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the crackling of flames. I noticed Marcus staring intently into the darkness beyond our camp. "You okay?" I asked him quietly. He startled, as if pulled from deep thought. "Yeah, just tired." But his eyes kept drifting back to the same spot in the forest. I followed his gaze but saw nothing except the silhouettes of trees against the night sky. Yet something felt wrong about them. Their proportions slightly off, branches reaching too far or bending at unnatural angles. Sleep came fitfully that night. I drifted in and out of consciousness, plagued by dreams of being watched from between the trees by something ancient and patient. Each time I woke, the whispers seemed louder, more insistent, though still unintelligible. Once, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing just outside our tent, tall and thin, almost indistinguishable from the trees around it. Morning brought no relief. The sky remained a dull gray, offering no clue as to the direction of the sun. Our breath hung in the air as we packed up camp in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. "I think we should try to backtrack," I suggested finally. "Find our way back to the main trail." "And waste a whole day?" Trevor objected. "We're already behind schedule." "We're lost, Trevor," Marcus snapped. Oh, uncharacteristic irritation in his voice. "The schedule is meaningless now." Tension crackled between them, and I noticed dark circles under Marcus's eyes, matching my own sleepless night. "Did anyone else have strange dreams?" Diane asked suddenly, her voice small. We all turned to look at her. "What kind of dreams?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Something watching us from the trees. And whispers." She trailed off. Trevor laughed, but it sounded forced. "Sounds like you've been listening to too many campfire stories." "I heard them too," I admitted. "The whispers." Marcus nodded slowly. "Same here." Only Trevor claimed to have slept soundly, which somehow made me more uneasy rather than less. We decided to head what we thought was east, hoping to intersect with our original route. As we hiked, the forest seemed to resist our progress. Roots emerged from the snow to trip us. Branches hung lower than they should have, and several times we had to detour around fallen trees that blocked our path. By midday, we were exhausted and no closer to finding our way out. The whispers had grown more persistent, and now all of us could hear them, except Trevor, who insisted it was just the wind in the trees. "There is no wind," Marcus repeated, his face pale. "There hasn't been any wind since we entered this forest." We stopped for a brief lunch, though none of us had much appetite. As I chewed mechanically on a protein bar, I noticed Diane staring at something behind me, her eyes wide with fear. I turned slowly, following her gaze. At first, I saw nothing unusual, just more trees. Then I noticed one that seemed different. Its trunk was too smooth, too straight, and its branches too symmetrical, almost like, "It's just a tree," Trevor said, but his voice lacked conviction. We all stared at it, none of us willing to admit what we were thinking, that the shape looked unnervingly human-like. A tall, thin figure standing perfectly still among the pines. "Let's keep moving," I said, and no one argued. As we continued our trek, I began to notice more of these strange, too perfect trees. They always seemed to be at the periphery of our vision, never directly in our path, but always present, watching. The whispers grew louder as daylight began to fade. Too soon, I thought, though I'd lost all sense of time in this place. They were almost comprehensible now, like dozens of voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. "We need to make camp," Trevor said, dropping his pack. "We can't risk hiking in the dark." None of us liked the idea of spending another night in these woods, but we had no choice. As we set up camp, I noticed that the strange trees had formed a loose circle around us, though I couldn't remember seeing them approach. That night, as we sat around the campfire, Marcus suddenly stood up, his gaze fixed on the darkness. "Do you see that?" he whispered. We all looked, but I saw nothing. "It's Ellen," he said, a smile spreading across his face. Ellen was his girlfriend who lived thousands of miles away in Boston. "Marcus, there's nothing there," I said gently, but he was already walking toward the edge of our camp. Diane grabbed his arm. "Don't." He shook her off. "She's calling me. Can't you hear her?" The whispers rose in intensity, and for a moment I thought I could almost make out a woman's voice among them, calling Marcus's name. Trevor and I both moved to stop him, but he shoved us back with surprising strength and strode into the darkness. We called after him, our voices swallowed by the endless trees. "We have to go after him," Diane said, already reaching for her flashlight. "No one leaves the camp," Trevor said firmly. "We'll look for him at first light." "He could be dead by then," Diane argued. "And we could all be dead if we go blundering through these woods in the dark," Trevor shot back. I sided with Trevor, though the decision weighed heavily on me. We took turns keeping watch that night, though I doubt any of us truly slept. The whispers were constant now, sometimes receding into the background only to surge forward with renewed intensity, like ocean waves breaking against my consciousness. During my watch, I could have sworn I saw figures moving between the trees, thin, elongated shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk, their movements fluid and unnatural. I told myself it was just shadows cast by the dying firelight, but I didn't believe it. Morning came, gray and cold. Marcus had not returned. We called his name as we packed up camp, our voices echoing uselessly among the trees. There was no response except the ever-present whispers, which seemed almost mocking now. "We need to find him," Diane insisted, her face drawn with worry. "We will," Trevor assured her, though the confidence that had characterized him throughout our friendship was noticeably absent. "But we also need to find our way out of here." We searched in widening circles around our campsite, looking for any sign of Marcus. After an hour, Diane called out, her voice tight with fear. "Over here!" We rushed to her side. She stood before one of the strange, too-perfect trees, holding something in her hand. It was Marcus's watch, the vintage Omega his father had given him when he graduated. It hung from one of the lower branches as if placed there deliberately. "He must be nearby," Trevor said, taking the watch and putting it in his pocket. We called Marcus's name with renewed urgency, but received only whispers in return. As we searched, I began to notice something disturbing about the ground beneath the snow. In places, it seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. I told myself it was just my imagination, stress playing tricks on my mind, but the sensation persisted. It was Diane who found the first real clue, a trail of footprints leading away from where we'd found the watch. They were unmistakably human, but strangely distorted, as if the person who made them had been walking on tiptoe or had unusually elongated feet. "Those can't be Marcus's," Trevor said, but we followed them anyway, desperate for any lead. The tracks led deeper into the forest, to areas where the trees grew so close together it seemed impossible to pass between them. Yet the footprints continued, winding through impossibly narrow gaps. "We can't follow any further," Trevor said after we'd squeezed through a particularly tight passage. "We'll get stuck." As if in response, a cry echoed through the forest, distant but unmistakably human. It might have been pain or fear or both. "That's him," Diane said, already pushing forward. "Wait," I called, but she was already slipping through the trees ahead. Trevor and I exchanged a glance before following. The forest seemed to close in behind us as we advanced, the way back disappearing as surely as if it had never existed. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and for the first time, I began to understand fragments of what they were saying. "Join us. Stay with us. Become." I shook my head violently, trying to clear it. "Do you hear what they're saying?" I asked Trevor. He gave me a concerned look. "They're just trees, Rob. Trees don't talk." But I could see the fear in his eyes, the uncertainty. He heard them too, I was sure of it. We caught up to Diane in a small clearing. The trees here formed a perfect circle, their branches intertwining overhead to create a natural dome. In the center stood another of those two perfect trees, but this one was different. Its trunk had features, knots and ridges that, when viewed from the right angle, formed the suggestion of a face. A human face contorted in agony. Diane stood before it, hand outstretched as if to touch it. "Don't," I said sharply, grabbing her wrist. She turned to me, and I was shocked by her expression. Not fear, but wonder, even longing. "It's calling to me," she whispered. "Can't you hear how beautiful it is?" The whispers had changed for her, I realized. Whatever she heard was not the same as what reached my ears. Trevor pulled her back from the tree. "We need to get out of here now." As he spoke, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. The tree with the face-like features seemed to be changing, its trunk twisting and rippling. A seam appeared down its center, like a mouth opening. "Run!" I shouted, pulling Diane with me as I turned to flee. But the way out of the clearing had vanished. Where there had been a gap between the trees, there was now only solid wall of interlocking trunks and branches. "This isn't possible," Trevor muttered, spinning around to look for another exit. There was none. We were trapped. The face tree's mouth opened wider, revealing not wood inside but a dark, hollow space. And from within that space emerged a figure. It took me several moments to recognize Marcus. His skin had taken on the texture and color of bark, his limbs elongated and fingers stretched into twig-like appendages. But the most horrifying change was his eyes. No longer human, but amber-colored sap that leaked down his wooden cheeks. "Join us," he said, but it wasn't his voice. It was the whispers, given form and substance through his transformed body. "Become part of the forest. It's beautiful here. Peaceful." Diane let out a choked sob. "Marcus, what happened to you?" He tilted his head at an impossible angle. "I found the truth. The Whispering Pines has existed for thousands of years, taking those who wander too deep, making them part of itself. Ellen showed me. She's here too." As if on cue, another figure emerged from behind Marcus. Feminine in shape but made of the same wood-like substance, her features an uncanny approximation of human. "That's not Ellen," Trevor said firmly. "Ellen is in Boston. This is some kind of hallucination or trick." "No tricks," the thing that had been Marcus said. "Only transformation. The forest is lonely. It needs company." I felt the whispers intensify, pressing against my mind like physical force. Images flashed before me. Myself as one of them, rooted in the ancient soil, part of something vast and eternal. It was horrifying, but there was also a seductive quality to it, a promise of belonging that resonated with some deep, primal part of me. Beside me, Diane swayed slightly, her eyes unfocused. "It doesn't sound so bad," she murmured. Trevor slapped her hard. She blinked, shock replacing the dreamy expression. "Don't listen to them," he hissed. "They're trying to get in your head." Marcus and the Ellen thing took a step forward, moving with that same fluid, unnatural grace I had glimpsed between the trees. "You can't leave," Marcus said. "You're already changing. Listen to your bodies." And with horror, I realized he was right. My skin felt different, tighter, rougher. Looking down at my hands, I saw that the veins beneath my skin had taken on a greenish hue, and my fingers seemed longer than before. Diane screamed, clutching at her arms where patches of bark-like material had begun to form. Only Trevor appeared unaffected, his expression hardening as he assessed our situation. "This isn't real," he insisted. "It's some kind of mass hallucination. The isolation, the cold, maybe something in the water." "Look at your friends," Marcus interrupted, gesturing at us with his twig fingers. "Is their transformation a hallucination too?" Trevor's certainty wavered, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. The circle of trees began to contract, closing in around us. The whispers reached a crescendo, hundreds of voices promising peace and togetherness if only we would surrender. In desperation, I reached for the emergency flare in my pack. If we couldn't find a way out, perhaps we could at least signal for help, unlikely as rescue seemed in this remote location. As my fingers closed around the flare, Marcus let out a hiss. "No fire," he said, genuine alarm in his inhuman voice. "Fire hurts us." That single moment of fear gave me an idea. I pulled out the flare and held it ready to strike. "Stay back," I warned as Marcus and the Ellen thing advanced. They hesitated, their wooden features contorting in what might have been fear. "Rob," Diane whimpered, holding up her arms where the transformation continued, bark now covering most of her forearms. "Help me." "The flare," I said to Trevor. "They're afraid of fire." Understanding dawned on his face. He reached into his own pack and withdrew our camp stove and fuel canister. "We're leaving," he announced to the forest at large, "and we're taking our friends with us." Marcus let out a sound between a laugh and a creaking of branches. "They're already ours. Soon they'll be just like us, just like all who wander into the whispering pines." "How many?" I asked, a sudden thought occurring to me. "How many people have you taken?" In answer, the trees around the clearing seemed to shimmer, and I realized with dawning horror that each one had a face, subtle contours in the bark that suggested human features. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all watching us with empty knotholes where eyes should be. The ranger's warning echoed in my mind. If you hear the pines whispering, don't listen. But it was too late for that. Trevor ignited the camp stove, its blue flame casting eerie shadows. The surrounding trees recoiled, creating a small space around us. "Here's what's going to happen," Trevor said, his voice steady despite everything. "We're walking out of here. You try to stop us, we burn this whole forest down." It was a bluff. Our small flame couldn't possibly threaten the vast woods, but the tree people seemed to believe it, drawing back further. "You'll never find your way out," Marcus said. "The forest doesn't want you to leave." "Then we'll make our own path," Trevor replied, reaching into his pack again and withdrawing his hatchet. The trees shuddered, a collective gasp running through them. Working quickly, we gathered what we could carry, abandoning the rest. Trevor led with the stove, while I brought up the rear with the flare ready. Diane walked between us, her transformation progressing but slower now, as if our resistance had weakened whatever power held us. Trevor began to hack at the wall of trees blocking our exit. The forest screamed, not in whispers now, but in a high, keening wail that set my teeth on edge. Where his hatchet bit into the wood, a thick amber fluid oozed out like blood. After several swings, a gap appeared, just wide enough for us to squeeze through. Beyond it, I could see more trees, but they seemed more natural, less threatening. "Go," Trevor urged, holding the gap open with his body. "Hurry." Diane went first, her movement stiff as the bark continued to spread across her skin. I followed, the whispers reaching a frantic pitch in my mind, begging me to stay, threatening what would happen if I left. As soon as we were through, Trevor started to follow, but something grabbed his ankle. A root that had erupted from the ground, wrapping around his leg like a serpent. "Go!" he shouted as more roots emerged, climbing up his body. "Get help!" I hesitated, unwilling to leave him. "Now, Rob!" His free hand thrust the camp stove toward me. "Take this and go!" I grabbed the stove and, with a last desperate look at my friend, pulled Diane away from the clearing. The last I saw of Trevor, roots and branches were enveloping him, pulling him back toward the face tree where Marcus waited. Diane and I fled through the forest, the camp stove's flame our only protection. The whispers pursued us, growing fainter as we ran but never quite disappearing. Every tree we passed seemed to reach for us, branches stretching like grasping hands. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and suddenly we broke free of the forest, emerging onto a snow-covered slope. Behind us, the whispering pines stood dark and impenetrable, but ahead, I could make out what looked like a ranger station in the distance. Diane collapsed beside me, the transformation having covered nearly half her body now. Her breathing was labored, and her eyes held a mixture of pain and resignation. "You have to go," she said, her voice barely recognizable. "Get help." "I'm not leaving you too," I insisted. She smiled sadly, bark cracking around her mouth as she did. "It's too late for me. I can feel it pulling me back, but you can still make it." As if to prove her point, her legs began to stretch, roots extending from her feet and burrowing into the snow toward the forest's edge. "Diane, fight it," I begged. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she whispered. "It's actually kind of peaceful, like becoming part of something bigger." Her eyes had begun to change, amber sap replacing the warm brown I'd known for years. "Tell them what happened to us," she said, her voice now more whisper than human speech. "Warn them about the whispering pines." I watched in helpless horror as the transformation accelerated, her body elongating and twisting into a shape more tree than human. In minutes, where Diane had stood was now a sapling, its slender trunk bearing the faintest suggestion of her face. With a cry of grief and terror, I turned and ran toward the ranger station, not looking back at the forest that had claimed my friends. 3 days later, I was recovering in a hospital in Anchorage. The rangers had found me half frozen and delirious, ranting about trees that whispered and friends who had been transformed. They attributed my story to hypothermia and trauma from being lost in the wilderness. A search party was dispatched to find Trevor, Marcus, and Diane, but they discovered only our abandoned campsite and equipment scattered through the forest. The official report listed my friends as missing, presumed dead from exposure. I tried to tell them the truth about the whispering pines, about the trees with faces, about what I had seen happen to my friends. The psychiatrist they brought in nodded sympathetically and increased my medication. No one believes me. Why would they? It sounds like madness even to my own ears. But I know what I saw. And sometimes in my dreams, I still hear the whispers. They're calling me back, promising reunion with my friends if only I return to the forest. I won't go, of course, but part of me wonders if I'm truly free. My skin sometimes feels strange, especially in the morning, tighter, rougher. And yesterday, I found a small patch of bark-like material on my forearm, right where it first appeared on Diane. The doctors say it's just a stress reaction, a physical manifestation of psychological trauma. They've scheduled more tests, more therapy. But I know better. The Whispering Pines isn't done with me. The transformation was only slowed, not stopped when I escaped the forest. Sooner or later it will claim me too, just as it claimed my friends. So I'm writing this as a warning. If you're planning a trip to Wrangell St. Elias National Park, stay on the marked trails. Don't venture near Blackburn Peak or the area the locals call the Whispering Pines. And, most importantly, if you hear the trees whispering, don't listen. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once the forest gets in your head, it never truly leaves. And I think I hear it calling me even now. My name is Laura Adams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Chugach Mountains about 40 miles east of Anchorage, Alaska. What was supposed to be a rejuvenating solo hiking trip to clear my head after my divorce turned into something I still cannot fully explain, something that visits me in my nightmares almost every night. I'd always been the adventurous type, even when my ex-husband Mark preferred staying in the city. Our differing views on life eventually drove us apart after 7 years of marriage. The divorce was finalized in March, and by July I felt suffocated by the sympathetic glances from friends and the emptiness of our, now my, Seattle apartment. I needed space, wilderness, and silence to rebuild myself. I chose Alaska because it represented everything my structured life wasn't: wild, unpredictable, and vast. The Chugach Range was recommended by a colleague who had hiked there the previous summer. "It'll change you," she had said with a smile. I had no idea how prophetic those words would be. My plan was straightforward: a 7-day trek through the Eagle River Valley to Crow Pass, and then looping back through the Hidden Valley Trail. I'd camp at designated sites, take photographs for my nature blog, and hopefully find some clarity about my life moving forward. I was experienced enough, having done several multi-day hikes in Washington and Oregon, though never completely alone. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. The landscape was breathtaking: towering mountains with snow-capped peaks, valleys carpeted with wildflowers, and glimpses of distant glaciers gleaming in the sunlight. The trail was challenging but manageable, and the physical exertion helped quiet the constant chatter in my mind. I set up camp each night feeling accomplished, muscles pleasantly sore, falling asleep to the gentle sounds of nature. It was on the 3rd day that things began to change. I woke before dawn, an unsettling feeling pulling me from sleep. Outside my tent, a thick fog had settled in the valley, limiting visibility to maybe 15 feet in any direction. I checked my phone to see the time, 5:17 a.m., and noticed there was no signal, which wasn't unexpected this deep in the mountains. What was strange, however, was that my fully charged battery from the night before now showed only 22%. "That's weird," I muttered, switching it to airplane mode to conserve what was left. I decided to wait for the fog to lift before breaking camp. I made coffee on my portable stove and sat on a fallen log, watching as the mist swirled around me. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound like someone inhaling sharply, followed by a low, melodic humming. It seemed to come from all directions at once. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding flat in the dense air. No response came. I told myself it was just the wind moving through the rock formations or perhaps a distant animal call distorted by the fog. Alaska was known for its diverse wildlife: bears, moose, wolves, but I'd taken all the recommended precautions, storing my food properly and carrying bear spray. By 10 a.m., the fog had thinned enough to continue hiking. According to my map, I should reach Crow Pass by late afternoon. I packed up and set out, the trail harder to follow in the lingering mist. The usual markers, cairns, signs, worn paths, seemed subtly different somehow. Twice I had to backtrack after finding myself facing dead ends that shouldn't have been there according to my map. The day grew unusually dark for July, with heavy clouds settling over the mountains. The temperature dropped sharply and I added layers, feeling the first prickles of unease. The trail began to climb steeply, winding through a section of dense, stunted pines that weren't marked on my map. The trees grew close together, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, scraping against my backpack as I pushed through. By mid-afternoon, I realized I was lost. The trail had faded completely, and my GPS app showed me being about half a mile off route, but in a direction that should have been a sheer cliff face. I knew I needed to get back on track before nightfall, so I tried to retrace my steps, using my compass to head southeast toward where the main trail should be. That's when the whispering started. At first, it was barely perceptible, a sound I might have attributed to the rustle of leaves or my own breathing, but gradually it became clearer. A woman's voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. It seemed to move around me, coming from behind a tree and then suddenly from a cluster of rocks to my left. "Is someone there?" I called out, my hand moving to the bear spray on my belt. "I'm a little turned around. Could use some help with directions." The whispering stopped immediately, leaving a silence so profound it felt solid. The hair on my arms stood up, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. I waited, straining to hear anything, but there was nothing, not even bird calls or the scurrying of small animals. The forest felt dead. I decided to climb to higher ground, hoping to get a better view of the surrounding area and maybe spot the correct trail. I found a rocky outcrop and carefully made my way up. From the top, I could see the valley stretching out below me, the fog now clinging to the lower elevations like a white sea. In the distance, the metallic blue of what must have been Eagle Glacier reflected the little light that penetrated the clouds. As I surveyed the landscape, trying to get my bearings, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the tree line about 100 yards away. From this distance, I could only make out that it was a person, seemingly watching me. I felt a flood of relief. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The figure didn't move or respond. As I watched, it slowly turned and walked into the trees, disappearing from view. "Wait!" I called, scrambling down from the rocks as quickly as safety allowed. I ran toward where I'd seen the person, pushing through underbrush and jumping over fallen logs. When I reached the spot, there was no one there and no signs that anyone had passed through recently. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I'd been so certain I'd seen someone. I circled the area, calling out, but the only response was the echo of my own voice bouncing back from the mountains. The sky had darkened considerably, and I knew I needed to find a safe place to camp for the night. I found a relatively flat area with good visibility in all directions, not wanting anyone or anything to approach without my knowledge. As I set up my tent with trembling hands, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night was the longest of my life. The temperature plummeted, far colder than forecasted for July, and my sleeping bag barely kept the chill at bay. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees with a sound uncomfortably like human wailing. I lay awake, clutching my hunting knife, starting at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. Around midnight, the whispering returned, closer now, seemingly right outside my tent. A woman's voice, speaking rapidly in what sounded like a mixture of English and something older, harsher. I strained to understand, catching phrases like "not welcome" and "her mountain" and "hungry" since 1952. I switched on my headlamp, the beam pitifully small in the vast darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't funny." The whispering stopped, replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. The nylon walls were thin enough that I should have seen a shadow if someone was walking around, but there was nothing. Just the sound of footfalls on the forest floor, completing one full circle before stopping directly in front of my tent's entrance. I held my breath, knife raised, waiting for the zipper to move or for someone to speak again. Nothing happened. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I slowly moved to the tent door and, summoning all my courage, quickly unzipped it and thrust my head out, headlamp scanning the area. There was no one there. The small clearing was empty, the surrounding forest still and silent. But on the ground, directly in front of my tent, was a crude figure made of twisted branches and what looked like animal bones, tied together with long strands of dark hair. Next to it was a single hiking boot, men's size, well-worn, that I'd never seen before. I jerked back into my tent, zipping it shut with shaking hands. A primal part of my brain was screaming at me to run, but I knew that fleeing into the unknown wilderness at night would be suicide. I had to wait until daylight. I sat up all night, knife in one hand, bear spray in the other, jumping at every sound. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric, I quickly packed up, deliberately leaving the branch figure and boot untouched. My phone was completely dead now, despite having been turned off all night. My map and compass would have to do. I headed downhill, reasoning that all valleys eventually lead to water sources, which often have trails alongside them. The forest seemed different in the morning light, older somehow, the trees more twisted and menacing than I remembered. Strange symbols had been carved into some of the trunks, crude pictures of stick figures and what looked like a tall, emaciated woman with 2 long limbs. Around mid-morning, I found a stream and decided to follow it downstream. Water sources were also vital for survival, and I needed to refill my bottles anyway. As I knelt by the water, I caught my reflection and gasped. There was a long, thin scratch across my cheek that I had no memory of receiving. I touched it gingerly. It wasn't deep, but looked hours old. The blood dried. I filled my bottles and purified the water, trying to focus on practical survival rather than the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. As I screwed the cap back on my second bottle, I noticed something in the water about 10 feet downstream, a dark mass that at first I took for a bundle of clothing. As I approached, the mass resolved itself into a backpack, a high-end model similar to my own, half submerged in the stream. I pulled it out, water streaming from its compartments. The pack was heavy, still full of gear. A luggage tag hung from one strap, bearing the name Matthew Chen and a Juneau address. I hesitated before opening it, feeling like I was invading someone's privacy, but the practical need for potential supplies or information won out. Inside were standard hiking supplies, water filters, dehydrated meals, first aid kit, and a journal, its pages swollen with water but largely still legible. With trembling hands, I opened the journal to the last entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier. July 1st, day 4 on the trail. Something's wrong with this place. The map doesn't match the terrain anymore. I've been going in circles despite following the compass exactly. Last night I heard a woman singing outside my tent. Old songs, lullabies maybe, but with wrong words. When I called out, it stopped. Found strange arrangements of sticks and bones around my campsite this morning. Moving on quickly. Need to get back to the ranger station. The trees watch me. The handwriting deteriorated toward the end of the entry, becoming jagged and pressed hard into the paper. There were no more entries after this one. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. Matthew Chen had been here, experienced the same things just weeks before, and now his pack was in the stream, abandoned. I searched the rest of the bag for a phone or GPS device but found nothing electronic. Just as I was about to zip it closed, my fingers brushed against something tucked into a side pocket. A small leather pouch containing a handful of small bones that looked disturbingly human, possibly finger bones, and a yellowed scrap of paper with the same strange symbols I'd seen carved into the trees. I left the backpack and its contents by the stream, no longer wanting anything to do with them. I had to get out of these mountains. I followed the stream with renewed urgency, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. The day grew unusually dark despite it being only early afternoon. The clouds overhead were almost black now, pressing down on the landscape like a physical weight. After about 2 hours of hiking, I spotted something through the trees, the angular shape of a human structure. Hope surged through me as I pushed forward, emerging into a small clearing containing a dilapidated cabin. Its logs were weathered gray. The roof partially collapsed on one side, but it was undeniably human-made, a sign of civilization in this increasingly alien wilderness. I approached cautiously, calling out to announce my presence. When no response came, I pushed open the creaking door and peered inside. The cabin was a single room, sparsely furnished with a rusted iron bed frame, a listing table, and a pot-bellied stove thick with dust. What caught my attention, however, were the walls. Every inch covered with the now familiar symbols, interspersed with newspaper clippings and photographs, all connected by red strings tacked from one to another. I stepped inside, drawn to the wall of information despite my fear. The newspaper clippings spanned decades, the oldest yellowed and fragile from the 1950s, the most recent from only last year. All detailed the same thing: hikers and campers who had gone missing in this region of the Chugach Mountains. Some were never found. Others were discovered days or weeks later, either dead from exposure with expressions of terror frozen on their faces, or alive but changed, unresponsive, unable or unwilling to speak about what had happened to them. Among the clippings was a black and white photograph from 1952 showing a group of miners outside what looked like a cave entrance. Their faces were blurred, as if they'd moved during the exposure except for one, a woman standing slightly apart from the group. Her image was perfectly clear, her face gaunt with hollow cheeks and large dark eyes that seemed to stare directly out of the photograph. Scrawled across the bottom in faded ink were the words, "Eleanor Blackwood, and the men she took." Another, more recent photograph showed a ranger station team with a map of the area. Areas circled in red with the words, "Do not search alone," written across the top. A list of names ran down one side, many crossed out. I recognized Matthew Chen's name among them. My hands trembling, I turned away from the wall and noticed a trap door in the floor, slightly ajar. A cold draft drifted up from the darkness below. Everything in me screamed to leave this place immediately, but a terrible curiosity pushed me forward. I needed to understand what was happening. Using my headlamp, I peered down into the darkness. A rough-hewn ladder descended about 10 feet to a dirt floor. Steeling myself, I began to climb down, the wood creaking ominously under my weight. The cellar was small, the ceiling so low I had to stoop. My headlamp revealed shelves lined with dusty mason jars containing dark substances I couldn't identify. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, arranged with clinical precision, were personal effects: watches, wedding rings, wallets, a collection of hiking boots, including one that appeared to match the single boot I'd found outside my tent, and a neat stack of driver's licenses. On top was Matthew Chen's, his smiling face at odds with the grim surroundings. Backing away in horror, my foot struck something soft. I swung my light down and bit back a scream. A sleeping bag lay open on the ground, recently used by the looks of it, a dark stain spreading from the middle. Next to it was a hiking boot that matched the one by my tent, and a journal open to an entry that began, "My name is Matthew Chen, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Chugach Mountains." A noise from above froze me in place, the cabin door opening, followed by slow, shuffling footsteps. I killed my headlamp immediately, plunging myself into darkness as I listened to someone, or something, moving around directly above me. The footsteps paused, and then deliberately moved toward the trap door. I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe. The trap door creaked as it was pulled fully open, and light from a lantern spilled down the ladder. Then came the voice I'd been hearing in whispers, now clear and conversational. "I know you're down there, Laura Adams from Seattle. I've been watching you since you crossed into my territory. You're trespassing, just like the others." The voice belonged to a woman, her tone almost friendly, as if we were neighbors chatting over a fence. I remained silent, frantically looking around for a weapon or escape route and finding neither. "Don't be rude now," the voice continued. "I prepared a place for you. Your divorce from Mark was difficult, wasn't it? You came here looking for a fresh start. I can give you that." Ice flooded my veins. I told no one on this trip about my divorce or my ex-husband's name. Slow footsteps descended the ladder. My headlamp revealed a gaunt woman with long, tangled gray hair wearing what might once have been Ranger's clothing, now tattered and stained. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were bright and alert, almost luminous in the dim light. She looked both incredibly old and strangely ageless. "Eleanor Blackwood," I whispered, recognizing her from the photograph upstairs, somehow unchanged after more than 70 years. She smiled, revealing blackened teeth. "The very same. I've been keeper of these mountains since the mining company tried to drive us out in '52. They thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Blast away our sacred peaks for gold. I showed them differently." She gestured to the shelves of jars. "They're still here, in a way, still useful." I noticed now that some of the jars contained what looked horribly like preserved human remains. Fingers, eyes, tongues. My stomach lurched. "What do you want from me?" I managed to ask, my back pressed against the cold earth wall. Eleanor cocked her head, studying me with those unnatural eyes. "Company, perhaps. It gets lonely here in winter. Or maybe ingredients. My supplies run low sometimes." She reached out a gnarled hand toward my face. "You have strong eyes, clear. They would see far in the dark months." I ducked away from her touch, mind racing. "The others," I said quickly, trying to distract her. "The missing hikers. What happened to them?" "Some joined me for a while," she said matter-of-factly. "Others weren't suitable. The mountains have many hungry mouths to feed." She smiled again. "Matthew lasted quite a while, very resilient, but in the end, even he tried to leave." She glanced at the sleeping bag with its dark stain. "No one leaves without my permission." While she spoke, I'd been inching toward the ladder. She noticed and moved with surprising speed to block my path. Now, she chided. "Don't be hasty. We've only just met properly. I want to know what brought you to my mountains. What pain drove you into my arms?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, desperately scanning the cellar for anything I could use as a weapon. "The mountains choose who they call," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "They taste your grief, your loss, your anger, like calls to like. Your broken heart sang to us, Laura, just as mine did all those years ago." As she spoke, the air in the cellar seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. Eleanor's form blurred at the edges as if she wasn't entirely solid. Behind her, shadows moved against the wall, elongated, spindly shapes that bore only a passing resemblance to human figures. With sudden clarity, I realized what was happening. This woman, or whatever she had become, was trying to recruit me, to transform me into something like herself. The thought broke through my fear, replacing it with determination. I was not going to die in this cellar. I was not going to become a ghost story told by future hikers. I lunged forward suddenly, catching Eleanor off guard. I slammed into her with all my strength, feeling her body give way too easily, as if she were partly hollow. She hissed like a punctured balloon, her hands clawing at my jacket as I pushed past her toward the ladder. I scrambled up, Eleanor's shrieks following me as I burst into the cabin. The walls seemed to be breathing now, the symbols writhing on the wood. Outside, the forest had gone completely dark despite it being mid-afternoon, and a wind had risen, howling around the cabin with the same human-like wail I'd heard the previous night. I grabbed my backpack, which I'd dropped by the door, and ran into the forest, no longer caring about direction, only about putting distance between myself and that cabin. The trees seemed to reach for me, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Behind me, Eleanor's voice rose above the wind. "You can run, Laura Adams, but you're still in my mountains. Every stream, every stone, every shadow belongs to me." I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself in a small clearing I didn't recognize. The sky overhead had turned a sickly green, and the air smelled of ozone and decay. I pulled out my compass with shaking hands, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. Night was approaching fast, too fast for natural twilight. I needed shelter, but the thought of setting up my tent, of being vulnerable in the darkness with only thin nylon between me and whatever Eleanor might send after me, was unbearable. I spotted a formation of rocks that formed a small cave-like shelter and made for it, checking carefully for animal signs before crawling in. The space was just big enough for me to sit with my knees pulled up to my chest. I fished emergency flares from my pack and laid them within easy reach, along with my knife and bear spray. Then I waited, listening to the forest grow quiet around me. Too quiet. The unnatural silence I was beginning to recognize as a prelude to Eleanor's appearances. Sure enough, as full darkness fell, the whispering started again. Not from any single direction, but seemingly from the ground itself, the rocks, the air. Multiple voices now, men and women, some pleading, others threatening. "Join us, Laura. You'll never be alone again. We were like you once, lost, afraid. Now we are eternal. Your body is temporary. Give it to the mountain. She'll find you eventually. Better to surrender. Less pain that way." I pressed my hands over my ears, but the voices continued, now seeming to come from inside my own head. My thoughts began to feel sluggish, and a strange lethargy crept over me. It would be so easy to give in, to stop fighting, to let Eleanor take me and make me part of her mountain. A sharp pain in my palm snapped me back to reality. I'd been clutching my hunting knife so hard that the blade had cut into my hand. The pain cleared my mind like a splash of cold water. These mountains, this entity, whatever it was, it fed on despair and surrender. I thought of my divorce, how I'd crawled out of that emotional abyss one day at a time. I could survive this too. He uncapped my water bottle and took a drink, focusing on the simple physical action. I needed a plan. My phone was dead, my compass useless, and I had no idea which direction would lead me back to civilization. But there had to be real ranger stations, roads, other hikers somewhere in these mountains. I just needed to keep moving, to not give in to the fear or the hypnotic whispers. As I formulated my plan, a new sound cut through the whispers. A low, mournful howl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Not a wolf, not any animal I recognized. It was answered by another, then another from different directions. Whatever they were encircling my position. I peered out from my shelter and saw them, gaunt, pale figures moving on all fours between the trees. In the darkness, they might have been mistaken for wolves or large dogs, but their movements were wrong. Jerky, uncoordinated, as if they were wearing bodies that didn't quite fit. As one passed closer to my hiding place, moonlight revealed a distorted human face stretched over an elongated skull, eyes milky white, mouth full of jagged teeth. These must have been the unsuitable hikers Eleanor had mentioned, transformed into hunting beasts for their mistress. Fear threatened to paralyze me, but I fought it back. I had one advantage. I knew these mountains weren't playing by normal rules anymore, which meant I didn't have to either. I waited until the creatures had passed by my shelter, then carefully crawled out, flares in hand. Instead of running or hiding, I climbed to the top of the rock formation and struck the first flare, holding it high above my head. The sudden burst of intense red light caused the creatures to shriek and recoil, their night-adapted eyes clearly sensitive to the brightness. "Eleanor Blackwood," I shouted into the night. "You want me? Come and face me yourself, not through your pets." The wind rose immediately, whipping around me with cyclonic force. The creatures retreated into the shadows, whimpering. The very ground seemed to tremble as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, then suddenly fell silent. From the darkness at the edge of my flare's light, Eleanor emerged, now somehow taller, thinner, her limbs too long and jointed in too many places. Her face was the same, though, that ageless, hungry look. "Bold," she said, her voice somehow both amused and furious. "Do you think that makes you special? That it will save you? Everyone breaks eventually." "Maybe," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady, "but I'm not broken yet, and I'm not alone." Eleanor laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Look around you, foolish girl. There's no one else here, just you, me, and my children." She gestured at the creatures lurking in the shadows. "That's where you're wrong," I said, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out Matthew Chen's driver's license, which I'd taken from the cellar. "I know what you did to him and to all the others. Their families know they came to these mountains. Rangers will be looking. Search parties will come." "Let them come," Eleanor hissed. "More for my collection." "Maybe," I acknowledged, "but they'll keep coming. And eventually, they'll bring more than you can handle. Helicopters, tracking dogs. Maybe they'll dynamite your precious mountains looking for their lost loved ones." It was a bluff, but I could see it hitting home. Eleanor's form flickered slightly at the mention of dynamite. "These mountains have stood for millennia," she snarled. "They've outlasted countless humans and their machines." "True," I said, striking my second flare as the first began to sputter. "But you haven't. You're tied to this place, Eleanor. What happens to it happens to you." I took a deep breath. "Let me go, and I'll make sure no one disturbs your mountains. I'll tell them it's too dangerous, that people should stay away. But if you harm me, I guarantee these forests will be crawling with search teams within days." Eleanor went very still, her unnatural eyes fixed on me. The wind died down, and the creature whispers ceased. For a long moment we stared at each other in the harsh red light of the flare. "Clever girl," she finally said, her voice a low whisper. "Is that what you think this is? A negotiation?" "No," I replied honestly. "It's a promise. One way or another, I'm leaving these mountains. Either alive, with your blessing, or dead, and bringing a world of trouble down on you." The air around Eleanor rippled, her form shifting between the withered old woman and something far more ancient and terrible, a spindly, almost insectile thing with too many joints and angles. When she spoke again, her voice seemed to come from the earth itself. "I could tear you apart before you took another step." "You could," I agreed, pulling out my third and final flare. "But you haven't. Why? In all these years, all these disappearances, you've been careful, picking off isolated hikers, covering your tracks. You don't want attention. You don't want to be found." Something changed in Eleanor's posture. A slight relaxation, a predator deciding whether the prey is worth the effort. "One night," she finally said. "You have until dawn. If you can find your way out of my mountains by then, you may go. If not, you're mine. That's my only offer." Before I could respond, she was gone. Not running or walking away, but simply not there anymore. The creatures in the shadows retreated with her, their eerie howls fading into the distance. I didn't waste time questioning my good fortune. I struck the third flare and used its light to gather my belongings. Direction was still a problem. My compass continued to spin uselessly and the stars overhead were obscured by clouds. But I remembered something from basic wilderness training. Water flows downhill, and inhabited areas tend to be in valleys or along coastlines. I had passed a stream earlier. If I could find it again and follow it downstream, it might eventually lead me to civilization. It was a desperate plan, but the only one I had. The next hours were a nightmare of stumbling through pitch-black forest by flare light, then by the weak beam of my headlamp as the flares expired. The terrain seemed to shift constantly, paths appearing and disappearing, rocks and fallen trees blocking routes that should have been clear. More than once I heard the howling of Eleanor's children in the distance, spurring me to greater speed despite my exhaustion. Around what must have been midnight, I found the stream, or a stream at least, and began to follow it downhill. The water moved sluggishly, almost reluctantly, as if fighting against gravity. Occasionally, I would see things floating past, small, pale objects that I deliberately avoided identifying too closely. As I hiked, Eleanor's whispers returned, but I kept moving, refusing to listen. I recited poems, sang songs, counted my steps, anything to drown out her voice. When that failed, I talked back, telling her about my life, my divorce, my hopes and fears. Not in surrender, but in defiance. I was Laura Adams. I had an identity, a history, a future. I was not just another jar on her shelf. The night stretched endlessly, my body operating on pure adrenaline and stubbornness. I fell countless times, each rise from the ground more difficult than the last. My clothes were torn, my skin scratched and bruised, but I kept moving downstream, one foot in front of the other. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, that I would collapse and wait for Eleanor to claim me with the dawn, I saw it, a pinprick of yellow light in the distance. Artificial light, human light. New energy flooded my limbs, and I picked up my pace, splashing through the stream when the banks became too dense with vegetation. The light grew larger, resolving into the illuminated windows of what appeared to be a small structure. As I drew closer, I saw it was a ranger station, a simple cabin with a radio antenna on the roof and a Park Service vehicle parked outside. I nearly wept with relief. Behind me, a furious howl rose from the forest. Eleanor, realizing her prey was about to escape. The howl was taken up by her creatures, a chorus of inhuman voices filled with rage and hunger. The trees at the edge of the clearing began to sway and bend, though there was no wind. I ran the final 100 yards to the station door, the world around me seeming to stretch and distort as if trying to push me back into the forest. The ranger station door felt miles away, my legs moving through invisible molasses. I risked a glance back and saw Eleanor standing at the forest's edge, her form now completely inhuman. A tall, skeletal figure with limbs that bent in impossible ways, surrounded by her pack of once human hunters. Her eyes burned with ancient hatred as they fixed on me. With a final surge of desperate energy, I reached the door and pounded on it with both fists, screaming for help. Behind me, the creatures began to pour out of the forest toward me. The door opened, spilling warm yellow light into the night. A startled ranger stood there, taking in my wild appearance with shock. "Help me," I gasped, falling forward into the doorway. "Please." The ranger caught me, pulling me inside. I heard snarls and scratching at the door as he quickly slammed it shut and locked it. "What in God's name is out there?" he demanded, reaching for his radio. "Are you being chased by wolves?" I looked out the window and saw only the normal forest, still and quiet in the pre-dawn light. No Eleanor, no creatures, just trees and shadows. "Not wolves," I managed to say before exhaustion finally claimed me, and I collapsed. I woke in a hospital in Anchorage 2 days later. They told me I had been suffering from severe dehydration, exposure, and exhaustion. The ranger who found me said I had been delirious, raving about a woman in the mountains and creatures hunting me. A search party found no sign of my campsite or any of the landmarks I described, including the abandoned cabin. The doctors suggested that I had experienced wilderness psychosis, hallucinations brought on by isolation, fatigue, and stress. A not uncommon occurrence among solo hikers, they assured me. They found no record of a Matthew Chen going missing in the area, nor of an Eleanor Blackwood associated with any mining operation in the 1950s. I almost believed them. Almost convinced myself that it had all been in my mind, until I was packing to leave the hospital and found something in the pocket of my jacket, which they had cleaned and stored for me, a small leather pouch containing finger bones and a scrap of yellowed paper covered in strange symbols. And pinned to the inside of the pouch, a note in faded ink. "You kept your promise, Laura Adams. Now keep mine. Tell them to stay away from my mountains." I burned the pouch and its contents that night in the hospital parking lot, watching the smoke curl into the dark Alaskan sky, carrying Eleanor's warning with it. That was 3 weeks ago. I've told the authorities that I got lost, that the cold and exhaustion caused me to hallucinate. I've thanked the search and rescue teams and deflected questions about what exactly happened out there. Most importantly, I've warned everyone who will listen that the eastern section of the Chugach Range is dangerous, that hikers should stay away. I'm back in Seattle now, in my apartment that no longer feels empty but rather like a sanctuary. Sometimes at night, I wake to the sound of whispering, a woman's voice speaking words I can't quite make out. The doctors say it's PTSD, that with time and therapy the memories will fade. But I know better, because sometimes when I look in the mirror, I see a thin scar across my cheek that wasn't there before, and in my dreams I see Eleanor standing at the edge of a forest, waiting with infinite patience. Waiting for me to keep my side of the bargain, waiting to see if I'll succeed in keeping others away from her mountains. And sometimes, in the moments between waking and sleeping, I wonder if I ever truly escaped at all, or if this is just another of Eleanor's illusions, allowing me to believe I'm free while some part of me remains forever in those whispering peaks. Another voice in her chorus of the lost. After all, no one really leaves her mountains without permission. My name is James Anderson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Chugach State Park, Alaska, just 5 months ago. The mountains had always called to me. Even as a kid growing up in Seattle, I'd stare at the distant peaks of the Cascades and feel something tugging at my soul. That's why when my company announced mandatory 2-week vacations to prevent burnout, I knew exactly where I was headed. Not to some beach resort or European city, but to the vast wilderness of Alaska's Chugach Mountains, where cell reception faded to nothing and the only sounds were those nature intended. My friends thought I was insane to go alone. "Serial killer bait," my colleague Diane had joked during our last meeting. "At least take bear spray." I'd laughed it off. I wasn't some amateur. I'd been backpacking solo for years, though admittedly never somewhere quite as remote as where I was planning. The Chugach Range offered some of the most pristine wilderness in North America, with trails that wound through dense forests, alongside crystal-clear streams, and up to viewpoints where you could see for miles across untouched valleys. I'd done my research, mapped my route, and packed meticulously. 5 days in, 5 days out, with a careful plan for each campsite. What I couldn't have planned for was Viktor Rostov. I first spotted him on my second day. I'd made good time from my starting point at the Eagle River Nature Center. hiking through the hemlock forest along the historic Iditarod Trail. The late June weather was perfect, cool enough to hike comfortably but warm enough that I wouldn't freeze at night. I'd set up camp near a small alpine lake nestled in a cirque below Peak 5320, a spot so beautiful it seemed almost unreal, like something from a high-end outdoor catalog. As I was filtering water from the lake, I noticed movement across the water. A man stood on the opposite shore watching me. He was tall and gaunt, with a long gray beard and a heavy pack. Even from a distance, something about his stillness unnerved me. I raised my hand in greeting, the universal hiker's hello. He didn't wave back. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing across the water. The man turned and disappeared into the trees. Strange, but not alarming. Some people came to the wilderness specifically to avoid human contact. I could respect that. I finished filtering my water and returned to camp, where I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated stroganoff and settled in with my book as the endless Alaskan summer daylight cast long shadows across the ground. I must have dozed off reading because I woke with a start, my book fallen to my chest. Something had woken me, a sound that didn't belong. I listened intently, hearing only the whisper of wind through the hemlocks and the occasional call of a bird. Then I heard it again, a branch snapping, close to my tent. "Hello," I called out, my voice tight. No response. I unzipped my tent and peered out. The midnight sun cast an eerie glow over the landscape. Not quite day, not quite night, but a strange liminal space between the two that played tricks on the eyes. Nothing moved. I grabbed my headlamp and swept the beam across the area surrounding my tent. The light caught something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Fresh ones, leading right up to my tent and then circling around it. Whoever had made them hadn't even tried to hide their presence. I scrambled fully out of the tent, heart pounding. "Is someone there?" I called, louder this time. Only silence answered me, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I debated turning back. Those footprints could have been from another hiker just curious about who was camping near their lake. But something about it felt off. Still, I'd planned this trip for months, and I hated the idea of letting one weird encounter spoil it. So I packed up and continued on my planned route, heading deeper into the Chugach Range. The trail grew more demanding as I ascended toward Crow Pass. The landscape opened up as I climbed above the tree line, revealing dramatic views of jagged peaks and hanging glaciers. Under normal circumstances, I would have been euphoric, taking photos every few minutes. Instead, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, scanning ridgelines for the silhouette of a tall, bearded man. By mid-afternoon, I reached the historic ruins of the Crow Creek Mine, where gold miners had once sought their fortunes. The crumbling stone structures stood as silent sentinels of a forgotten era. As I explored the ruins, I spotted a faded name scratched into one of the stones. V. Rostov, 1976. A coincidence, surely. Just some old miner's graffiti. I pitched my tent near a small stream beyond the ruins, choosing a spot with good visibility in all directions. As I cooked dinner, I noticed something unusual about the stream. The water seemed to be flowing upstream in places, defying gravity. I blinked hard and looked again. Normal, just a trick of the fading light. That night, I fell into an uneasy sleep filled with fractured dreams. In one, I was trying to run down the trail, but my legs moved like they were submerged in molasses. Behind me, something was gaining ground, its labored breathing growing louder. I woke, gasping, my sleeping bag drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. Something was scratching at my tent. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, deliberate, slow scratches against the nylon. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The scratching stopped. Then, "James." A voice like gravel being crushed underfoot. James Anderson. Ice flooded my veins. I hadn't told anyone my name out here. I hadn't seen another soul since the bearded man by the lake. "What do you want?" I called out, fumbling for my bear spray. "You're in my territory now." The voice was closer, just on the other side of the thin fabric. "No one comes to my mountains without paying a toll." "I don't want any trouble," I said, my fingers closing around the bear spray canister. "I'm just passing through." A low chuckle. "That's what they all say, but no one just passes through. The mountains take something from everyone." The zipper of my tent began to move, slowly inching upward. I pointed the bear spray at the opening, finger tensed on the trigger. The zipper stopped. Through the small gap, I could see a single bloodshot eye staring in at me. I squeezed the trigger. The hissing stream of capsaicin hit its mark, and a howl of rage and pain split the night. I grabbed my headlamp and emergency whistle, burst out of the tent, and ran blindly down the trail, not caring about direction or destination, just needing to put distance between myself and whatever was back there. After running for what felt like miles, a stitch burning in my side, I collapsed behind a large boulder and tried to control my breathing. I listened for pursuit but heard nothing except the pounding of my own heart. I'd left everything behind: my tent, sleeping bag, most of my food, my GPS device. All I had was what I'd been able to grab: my headlamp, whistle, the clothes on my back, and a small emergency kit I kept in my pocket. The rational part of my brain tried to make sense of what had happened. It was just a man, probably the same bearded hiker I'd seen earlier, maybe a squatter who lived in these mountains and didn't like visitors. The strange voice, the knowledge of my name. I was tired, stressed, hearing things. There had to be a logical explanation, but as the adrenaline subsided, doubt crept in. Had he really said my name? Or had my fear-addled brain imagined it? I spent the rest of the night huddled behind that boulder, too terrified to move, too wired to sleep. As dawn broke, I faced a difficult decision. I was now without most of my gear, at least a day's hike from the nearest trailhead. The smart move would be to head back the way I came, retrieve my gear if possible, and get the hell out of these mountains. But the thought of returning to that campsite made my skin crawl. Forward, then. I'd continue on my planned route toward the Eagle Glacier, where there was a public-use cabin. If I could reach it, I'd have shelter and possibly other hikers for safety. The day's hike was grueling. Without my trekking poles or proper food, every step was a struggle. The breathtaking scenery, massive glaciers spilling between towering peaks, barely registered as I pushed myself onward, constantly scanning my surroundings for any sign of the bearded man. By late afternoon, I'd reached Eagle Glacier, its massive blue-white face calving occasional chunks of ice into the lake below with thunderous cracks. The public-use cabin stood on a rise overlooking the glacier, a simple wooden structure that looked like heaven to my exhausted eyes. As I approached, I noticed smoke curling from the chimney. Someone was already there. Relief and wariness battled within me. On one hand, other people meant safety. On the other, what if? I steeled myself and knocked on the door. It swung open to reveal a middle-aged couple in matching flannel shirts, Bill and Martha Thompson from Anchorage, up for a weekend at the cabin. They took one look at my haggard appearance and ushered me inside, where they fed me hot soup and listened wide-eyed to a sanitized version of my story. I'd gotten spooked by what I thought was a bear, ran without my gear, and got lost. "You're not the first person to mention a strange man in these parts," Bill said as darkness fell outside. "There's an old story about a Russian trapper who got lost in the Chugach Mountains back in the 70s. Viktor Rostov. They never found his body, but some hikers claim they've seen him wandering the trails." Martha shot him a disapproving look. "Don't scare the poor man more, Bill. It's just a local ghost story." "Ghost story or not, strange things happen in these mountains," Bill continued. "Last year, a solo hiker disappeared without a trace near Crow Pass. All they found was his tent, slashed open from the inside." I slept fitfully that night on the cabin's wooden bench, grateful for the Thompsons' presence but unable to shake the memory of that bloodshot eye peering into my tent. The next morning, Bill offered to hike back with me to retrieve my gear, but I declined. I'd rather replace everything than ever see that campsite again. Instead, I decided to hike out with them when they left later that day. Safety in numbers. As we prepared to leave, I stepped outside to fill our water bottles at the stream beside the cabin. The water was ice cold, fresh from the glacier. As I knelt by the stream, I noticed something strange in the clear water, a reflection that wasn't mine. I looked up sharply. No one was there. I gazed back at the water. The reflection remained, the bearded face of an old man grinning at me with blackened teeth. I scrambled backward with a shout, dropping the water bottles. By the time Bill and Martha rushed outside, I was backing away from the stream, pointing wordlessly at the water. Bill approached cautiously and looked. "There's nothing there, James. Just water." I looked again. He was right. Just my own pale, frightened face stared back at me. The hike out was tense. Every shadow among the trees a potential threat. Bill and Martha exchanged concerned glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I didn't blame them. I must have seemed half mad, jumping at every snapping twig, eyes constantly darting around. We were about an hour from the trailhead when Martha stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, listening. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came, a distant, rhythmic thumping, like someone pounding a heavy object against wood. "Probably a woodpecker," Bill suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Not a woodpecker. It was too deliberate, too measured. Thump, thump, thump. "Let's pick up the pace," Bill said, his earlier bravado evaporating. We moved faster, almost jogging down the trail. The thumping followed, always just out of sight, growing louder. Along with it came a new sound, a low, atonal humming that raised the hair on my arms. Martha stumbled, crying out as her ankle twisted. Bill and I caught her before she fell. "I can't walk," she gasped, tears of pain welling in her eyes. The thumping stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear something moving through the underbrush circling around us. "We need to get her out of here," I said to Bill, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll take one arm, you take the other." Supporting Martha between us, we continued down the trail as quickly as we could manage. The presence in the forest kept pace, occasionally snapping branches or rustling leaves, letting us know it was there. "What is it?" Martha whispered, her face pale with fear and pain. "Just an animal," Bill said firmly. "Maybe a moose. They get curious sometimes." But we all knew it wasn't a moose. The trail curved around a massive boulder, and as we rounded it, I nearly collided with a figure standing directly in our path. The bearded man, Viktor Rostov. Up close, he was even more terrifying, his skin leather tough and deeply creased, eyes bloodshot and yellowed, clothes tattered and stained. He smelled of damp earth and decay. "The toll," he rasped, holding out a gnarled hand. "Everyone pays the toll." Bill pushed Martha behind him. "We don't want any trouble, mister. We're just trying to get back to the trailhead." Victor's eyes never left mine. "Not you. Him." He pointed one filthy finger at me. "James Anderson. You walked my mountains. You breathed my air. You owe the toll." "I don't have anything," I said, my mouth bone dry. "You scared me away from all my gear, remember?" A slow, terrible smile spread across his face, revealing teeth filed to points. "Oh, I don't want your things. The mountains require something more. Personal." He lunged forward with shocking speed, fingers clawing for my face. I stumbled backward, falling hard on the rocky trail. Bill shouted and moved to help me, but Victor made a sharp gesture with his hand, and both Bill and Martha froze in place, eyes wide with terror but bodies completely immobile. Victor leaned over me, his rancid breath hot on my face. "The toll is memory," he whispered. "A piece of your life. Give it freely, or I take it all." His hand shot out, fingers pressing against my forehead with crushing force. Pain exploded behind my eyes, white-hot and all-consuming. I felt something being pulled from me, unspooling like thread from a spool, memories flashing before me and then vanishing into nothingness. My 10th birthday, gone. My first kiss, gone. My college graduation, gone. My mother's funeral, gone. I screamed, trying to pull away, but his grip was inhumanly strong. Through the haze of agony, I saw something else, images that weren't mine. A young Viktor Rostov, lost in a blizzard. The slow realization that he wouldn't make it out alive. The desperate bargain made with something that lived in the mountains. Not death, but a half-life, sustained by stealing memories from those who passed through his territory. With the last of my strength, I reached for the emergency whistle still hanging around my neck and blew it as hard as I could. The shrill sound pierced the air, and Victor recoiled, hands clapped over his ears. In that moment of distraction, I scrambled away, grabbing a fist-sized rock from the trail. When he lunged at me again, I swung the rock with every ounce of strength I had left, connecting solidly with his temple. Victor crumpled to the ground, a look of surprise on his ancient face. Bill and Martha suddenly staggered as whatever force had held them in place released its grip. "Run!" I shouted, not waiting to see if Victor would rise again. We fled down the trail, half carrying Martha between us, not stopping until we burst out of the forest onto the parking lot at the trailhead. Only then did I chance a look back. The forest stood silent and innocuous in the afternoon sunlight. No sign of pursuit. Bill drove us straight to the hospital in Anchorage, where Martha was treated for a sprained ankle and I was examined for a concussion. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with me, despite my insistence that something had been taken. It wasn't until days later, back in my apartment in Seattle, that I began to realize the extent of what I'd lost. Holes in my memory. Subtle at first, then more noticeable. Birthdays I couldn't recall. Friends whose names slipped away from me. Skills I'd once mastered now frustratingly out of reach. I tried explaining what had happened to my therapist, who gently suggested it was PTSD from a traumatic wilderness experience, possibly exacerbated by dehydration and elevation sickness. A reasonable explanation. Logical. Safe. But at night, I dream of Viktor Rostov. In these dreams, he's sitting by a fire in a cave high in the Chugach Mountains, sifting through my stolen memories like precious gems, absorbing them, using them to extend his unnatural existence for a few more years. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of someone else looking back. A gaunt face with a long beard and bloodshot eyes, smiling with pointed teeth. The strangest part? Despite everything, the mountains still call to me. There's a pull I can't explain, a yearning to return to the Chugach. To find Victor again. To reclaim what was taken. I've already started planning my next trip. I tell myself it's to face my fears, to prove to myself that what happened was just a trauma-induced hallucination. But deep down, I know the truth. The mountains took something from me. And I'm not the only one. There are others out there with holes in their minds where memories should be, all drawn back to the same peaks and valleys like moths to a flame. If you go hiking in the Chugach Mountains and meet a man named Viktor Rostov, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once he takes something from you, a part of you will always belong to those mountains, and eventually, the mountains always call their debts due. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Alaska's Chugach Mountains last summer, when what was supposed to be a weekend hiking trip with friends turned into something I still can't fully explain, or forget. It started as a celebration. Devin had just gotten engaged to his girlfriend of 3 years, and our friend group decided a guy's trip was in order. Devin, Chris, Nate, and me, 4 friends who'd known each other since college. We considered ourselves experienced hikers, having tackled trails across the Pacific Northwest over the years, but none of us had ventured into the remote wilderness of Alaska before. The Chugach Range had been on our bucket list for years. We'd read about its pristine alpine meadows, dramatic ridgelines, and the way the northern lights sometimes painted the sky above them. When flight deals to Anchorage popped up, it felt like the universe was giving us a sign. To new beginnings, Devin had said as we clinked our beers together the night before at our rented cabin near the trailhead, and to conquering new mountains. If only we'd known what was waiting for us up there. The morning dawned crisp and clear. We'd mapped out a 3-day loop through the Eklutna Lake area, planning to reach Eagle Peak, a challenging but supposedly rewarding summit with views that stretched all the way to the ocean on clear days. The trail began along the shores of the turquoise lake, then wound its way up into densely forested slopes. I remember how good it felt to be out there. The air was different, sharper, cleaner than what I was used to back in Seattle. The light had a different quality too, brighter somehow, making everything look slightly more vivid than real life. "Check out the size of these trees," Chris said, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed forest. He was our group's nature enthusiast, always stopping to identify plants or animal tracks. "You guys see that?" Nate asked, pointing to claw marks running up the trunk of a massive spruce. "Bear sign." We'd done our research. Alaska had both black and brown bears. We carried bear spray, bear-proof food containers, and knew to make noise while hiking. Still, seeing those gouges in the bark, some of them higher than I could reach, sent a chill through me. "Just be loud," Devin said with forced confidence. "They'll avoid us if they hear us coming." For the next few hours, we hiked steadily upward, chatting and occasionally breaking into random songs to announce our presence to any wildlife. The trail grew steeper, transforming from soft forest floor to rocky switchbacks as we climbed above the tree line. By mid-afternoon, we reached a small alpine plateau where we decided to make camp. A crystalline stream curved around one edge of the flat area, providing fresh water. The spot offered breathtaking views back down to the lake and across to neighboring peaks. "This is the life," Devin said as we set up our tents. "No cell service, no emails, no wedding planning. Just us and the mountains," Chris added, already gathering stones to make a fire pit. That was the last normal moment I can recall. Devin joking about his fiancé's obsession with table settings, Nate showing us the fancy new camping stove he'd splurged on, Chris identifying the calls of birds I'd never heard before. The strangeness began that evening. We'd finished dinner, dehydrated camping meals that tasted surprisingly good after the day's exertion, and were sitting around the small fire Chris had built, passing a flask of whiskey between us. "Did you guys hear that?" Nate asked suddenly, his head tilted slightly. We fell silent, listening. At first, I heard nothing beyond the soft crackle of our fire and the whisper of wind through the sparse, stunted trees that managed to grow at this elevation. Then I heard it, a sound that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal. Like singing, but with no discernible melody or words. More like humming that rose and fell in pitch, coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond our campsite. "Probably just the wind," Devin said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Wind doesn't sound like that," Chris whispered, his body tense. The sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then faded. We looked at each other, no one wanting to be the first to admit it had unsettled them. "Maybe it's other hikers," I suggested, though we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. Nate stood up, fumbling for his headlamp. "I'm going to check it out." "Are you insane?" Devin hissed. "It's pitch black out there, and we're in bear country." "It didn't sound like a bear," Nate insisted. "Could be a fox or coyote," Chris offered. "Some animals make weird vocalizations." "I've never heard any animal that sounds like that," Nate said, but he sat back down, his eyes still scanning the darkness beyond our fire's glow. We tried to shake it off, returning to our conversation about plans for the next day's hike to the summit. But the mood had shifted. We found ourselves speaking more quietly, as if afraid of being overheard, and our eyes kept drifting to the dark wall of night surrounding us. When we finally turned in, I lay awake in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, listening. The sound didn't return, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something out there was listening to us. Morning came with a heavy mist that shrouded the mountains, making it impossible to see more than 50 feet in any direction. My watch said it was 7:30 a.m., but the light was strangely dim, as if the sun was struggling to penetrate the fog. "Weather report didn't mention this," Devin grumbled as we boiled water for coffee. "Mountain weather is unpredictable," Chris said with a shrug, though I noticed he kept glancing nervously at the wall of white surrounding us. We decided to wait to see if the mist would burn off before attempting the summit. By 10 a.m., it had thinned somewhat, but still clung to the landscape like a living thing, writhing and curling around rocks and the few twisted trees. "We should probably head back down," I suggested, "if we can't see where we're going." "No way," Nate interrupted. "We came all this way. Eagle Peak is only a few hours from here. The fog might clear completely by the time we get higher." Devin and Chris exchanged looks, clearly torn. None of us wanted to be the one to suggest abandoning our goal. "Let's at least try," Devin finally said. "We can always turn back if conditions worsen." We packed up camp, leaving the tents since we planned to return to the same spot that evening. Taking only day packs with water, food, first aid supplies, and extra layers, we set off toward what we hoped was the trail to Eagle Peak. Almost immediately, I felt uneasy. The mist distorted sounds and distances, making it difficult to tell how far we'd gone or in what direction. The trail, which had been clear the day before, now seemed to fade in and out of visibility. "Are we still on track?" I asked after we'd been hiking for about an hour. Chris pulled out his GPS. "Should be, but..." He frowned at the device, tapping the screen. "That's weird. It's saying we're off the trail, but I can clearly see it right here." We clustered around him, staring at the screen. According to the GPS, we were several hundred feet south of where the trail should be. "Maybe the signal's bouncing off something?" Devin suggested. "These mountains could be interfering." "Let's just follow the physical trail," Nate said confidently. "It has to lead somewhere." We continued on, but my sense of disorientation grew stronger. The mist occasionally parted enough to reveal glimpses of the landscape around us, but nothing looked familiar or matched what we expected to see. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with loose scree that shifted treacherously under our boots and rocks that required scrambling on all fours. "This can't be right," I finally said after we'd been climbing for another hour. "The trail to Eagle Peak is supposed to be difficult but well-defined. This feels like we're just climbing up random scree fields." "Let me check the GPS again," Chris said, pulling it out. His face paled as he looked at the screen. "What the hell? Now it's saying we're 2 miles from where we were an hour ago. That's not possible." "Let me see," Devin said, taking the device. After studying it for a moment, he looked up, his expression troubled. "This makes no sense. According to this, we've been walking in circles." "That's impossible," Nate snapped. "We've been climbing steadily upward the whole time." As if in response to our confusion, the mist suddenly parted, giving us our first clear view of the surroundings since morning. What I saw made my stomach drop. We were standing on a narrow ridge I didn't recognize, with steep drop-offs on either side. In the distance rose a jagged peak that looked nothing like the rounded summit of Eagle Peak I'd seen in photos. "Where the hell are we?" Devin whispered. Before anyone could answer, the mist closed in again, thicker than before, and with it came the sound, that same eerie humming we'd heard the night before, but closer now, seeming to come from all around us. "We need to go back," I said, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Now!" For once, no one argued. We turned around, trying to retrace our steps, but the path we'd taken seemed to have vanished. Where there had been a clear trail of disturbed scree from our ascent, there was now only untouched rock. "This isn't right," Chris muttered, his voice tight with fear. "This isn't possible." The humming grew louder, rising and falling in that same unsettling pattern that was almost like words but not quite. And then, through the mist, I saw a figure. It stood perhaps 50 yards away, its outline blurred by fog but unmistakably human in shape. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and unnaturally thin. "Hello?" Devin called out, his voice cracking slightly. "We're a bit turned around. Can you help us?" The figure didn't move or respond. The humming continued, though I couldn't tell if it was coming from the figure or from somewhere else in the mist. "Let's go this way," Nate said urgently, pointing in the opposite direction from the figure. "I think I see a path." We hurried after him, stumbling over rocks in our haste. I glanced back once and the figure was gone, or at least hidden again by the swirling mist. We descended as quickly as we safely could, though none of us had any real confidence we were heading in the right direction. The fog pressed in, cold and damp against my skin, seeming to cling to me like something alive. My watch said it was only 2 p.m., but the light was fading as if evening was approaching. "We need to find somewhere to stop before it gets dark," Chris said, his voice the forced calm of someone fighting panic. "Preferably somewhere defensible." "Defensible from what?" Devin asked. Chris didn't answer. We eventually found a small outcropping of rock that offered some shelter, a shallow overhang we could sit under, with a solid rock face at our backs and a view of the slope below us. Not ideal, but better than being completely exposed on the mountainside. "Let's try the emergency beacon," I suggested, reaching for the small device we'd brought as a precaution. I pressed the button, but the confirmation light didn't flash. I tried again. Nothing. "Battery's probably dead," Nate said, though we'd checked it before leaving and it had been fully charged. We huddled together as daylight continued to fade, sharing what remained of our food and water. None of us spoke about what we'd seen or the impossibility of our situation. Instead, we made plans as if everything was normal. We'd wait out the night, and in the morning, when the fog cleared, we'd find our way back to our campsite. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness fell. We had emergency blankets in our packs, but no sleeping bags or tents. Pressed together for warmth, we prepared for a long, uncomfortable night. That's when we heard the screaming. It came from somewhere below us on the mountainside, a man's voice, raw with terror, screaming words I couldn't make out but which chilled me more deeply than the night air. "That's a person in trouble," Nate said, already on his feet. "We have to help." "Wait," Chris grabbed his arm. "It could be a trap." "A trap? What are you talking about?" Nate pulled free. "Someone's hurt down there." "That doesn't sound like any injury I've ever heard," Chris insisted. "And how would someone else even be out here? We haven't seen another soul since we started." The screaming stopped abruptly, cut off mid-cry. "Hello," Devin called out, his voice echoing across the mountainside. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" Silence answered him, a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. Then came the humming again, closer than before, and with it, footsteps crunching on rock. "Turn off your headlamps," Chris whispered urgently. "What? Why would we?" Nate began. "Just do it," Chris hissed, already switching his off. In the sudden darkness, the footsteps grew louder. They were coming up the slope toward us, steady and deliberate. The humming rose and fell, almost like a hunting call. I held my breath, pressed against the rock face, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it must be audible. The footsteps stopped just below our position. I could hear breathing, ragged, wet breaths that didn't sound quite human. Then Devin's voice came from beside me, but wrong, distorted somehow. "We should go toward the sound," he said in a flat tone I'd never heard from him before. "I think it's trying to help us." "Devin?" I whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. His body was rigid, trembling slightly. "The Wendigo wants to show us the way," Devin continued in that same flat voice. "It's hungry, so hungry, but it will help us first." Chris's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "That's not Devin talking," he whispered, his lips right against my ear. "What does he mean, Wendigo?" Nate whispered from my other side. I'd heard the term before, a mythological creature from Native American folklore, a malevolent spirit associated with winter, famine, and cannibalism, a being that possessed humans and drove them to unspeakable acts. "Devin," I said, louder this time, shaking his shoulder. "Snap out of it." He turned toward me, and even in the darkness I could see his eyes, wide and empty, reflecting what little ambient light there was like an animal's. "It's been so long since it fed," Devin said, his voice still eerily flat. "So long alone in these mountains." Then he blinked, shook his head as if clearing it, and his eyes returned to normal. "What? What's going on? Why are we sitting in the dark?" Before any of us could answer, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before tore through the night. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between, filled with hunger and rage. It came from directly below us, so close I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. "Run!" Chris yelled, switching his headlamp back on. We scrambled up from under the overhang, not caring about the direction, just desperate to get away from whatever had made that sound. My headlamp carved a small tunnel of light through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and sparse, twisted vegetation as I ran. I could hear the others behind me, their breathing ragged, boots scraping on rock, and behind them, something else, something that moved with a strange, loping gait, faster than anything human should be able to move across such difficult terrain. "There!" Nate shouted, pointing ahead. "I see trees!" Sure enough, the beam of his headlamp caught the edge of what looked like forest. We'd somehow descended enough to reach the tree line again. Trees meant cover, somewhere to hide. We plunged into the forest, the stunted pines growing more densely as we continued downward. The darkness beneath the canopy was absolute, except for the beams of our headlamps, which caught the ghostly shapes of trunks and branches, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. "Stop!" Chris gasped after we'd been running for what felt like an eternity. "Need to catch my breath." We halted, all of us bent double, lungs burning. For a moment, the only sound was our labored breathing and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. "Do you think we lost it?" Devin asked, his voice small and frightened. As if in answer, branches cracked somewhere behind us, followed by that same horrible humming. "Keep moving," I urged, pushing forward again though my legs felt like lead. We stumbled on through the forest, which seemed to grow denser and stranger the further we went. The trees were twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching out like grasping hands. The ground beneath our feet was spongy and uneven, making every step treacherous. "Does anyone recognize where we are?" Nate asked, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. None of us did. This forest was nothing like the one we'd hiked through on our way up. These trees were older somehow, more primeval, with thick coating of moss that glowed faintly phosphorescent in the beams of our headlamps. "My GPS is completely dead," Chris reported, showing us the blank screen. "So is my phone." I checked my own devices. Same result. "Mine too," Devin said. Then, more softly, what was happening to me back there? I remember saying things, but it wasn't me saying them. "Let's keep that conversation for when we're somewhere safe," I said, not wanting to dwell on what had happened, on what it might mean. We continued our descent, the forest gradually thinning until we emerged at the edge of what appeared to be a small valley. In the center stood a cabin, light glowing warmly from its windows. "Thank God," Nate breathed. "Civilization." But something felt wrong. The cabin looked too perfect, too inviting, like something from a fairy tale rather than a real structure in the Alaskan wilderness. "Wait," Chris said, grabbing Nate's arm as he started toward it. "That can't be right. There shouldn't be any cabins in this area. We're in a national forest." "Maybe it's a ranger station," Devin suggested hopefully. "Does that look like a ranger station to you?" Chris asked. It didn't. It looked like a private home, rustic but well-maintained, with smoke curling invitingly from the chimney. "I don't care what it is," Nate said, pulling free of Chris's grip. "It's shelter, and there are people who can help us." He started down the slope toward the cabin. "Nate, wait!" I called after him, but he either didn't hear me or chose to ignore me. "We have to go after him," Devin said. Chris shook his head. "I don't think we should go near that place. We can't just leave him," I argued. In the end, our concern for Nate overrode our unease. We followed him down the slope, our headlamps bobbing in the darkness. By the time we reached the valley floor, Nate was already at the cabin door, knocking. As we approached, the door swung open, spilling warm light across the ground. A woman stood in the doorway, elderly but straight-backed with long silver hair and sharp features. She smiled at Nate, though the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice melodious but with an accent I couldn't place. "You boys look lost." "We are," Nate said, relief evident in his voice. "We were hiking to Eagle Peak but got disoriented in the fog. Is there any chance we could use your phone to call for help?" Of course," the woman said, stepping back from the doorway. "Come in, all of you. You must be freezing." Nate entered without hesitation. Devin followed, but Chris and I exchanged worried glances before reluctantly stepping over the threshold. The interior of the cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled merrily. Furs and woven blankets adorned the walls and floor. A table set for 4 stood in one corner, laden with food, a stew bubbling in a cast-iron pot, fresh bread, and what looked like berry pie. "You're in luck," the woman said, closing the door behind us. "I was expecting company. I'm Agnes Blackwood." "Thank you for taking us in, Agnes," Devin said politely. "I'm Devin, and these are my friends Nate, Chris, and Michael." Sit," Agnes urged, gesturing to the table. "You must be starving after your ordeal." My stomach growled at the sight and smell of the food, reminding me we'd had nothing but trail mix and energy bars all day. Still, something held me back. "Could we use your phone first?" I asked. A shadow passed over Agnes's face, so quickly I might have imagined it. "Of course, but I'm afraid it's not working at the moment. Storm last week took out the line. I've been waiting for someone to come fix it." "Do you have a radio? Any way to communicate with the outside?" Chris asked. Agnes shook her head. "I'm rather cut off up here. But don't worry, you can rest tonight, and tomorrow I'll show you the trail back to the main road. It's not far, though it's not a route many know about." "How did you end up living all the way out here?" Devin asked as Agnes began ladling stew into bowls. "Oh, I've always preferred solitude," she said with another of those smiles that didn't reach her eyes. "My husband and I built this place 40 years ago. He's gone now, but I could never leave. The mountains get in your blood." Nate had already taken a seat at the table and was eyeing the food hungrily. Devin joined him, though he still looked uneasy. "Where exactly are we?" Chris asked, still standing by the door. "We were in the Chugach Range, near Eklutna Lake." Agnes set down the ladle, her movements suddenly less fluid. "You're still in the Chugach," she said after a moment, though a rather remote part of it. "But how far from Eklutna Lake?" I pressed. "Oh, I couldn't say exactly," Agnes replied, waving a hand dismissively. "I don't get down that way much. Eat now, questions later. You boys need your strength." Reluctantly, Chris and I joined the others at the table. The stew smelled incredible, rich and savory with chunks of meat and root vegetables. My stomach clenched with hunger, but something stopped me from picking up my spoon. "What kind of meat is this?" I asked. Agnes paused in the act of cutting bread. "Venison," she said smoothly. "From a deer my nephew brought me last month." Nate was already eating, making appreciative noises. "This is amazing," he said between bites. Devin took a tentative taste, then began eating with enthusiasm. "It really is good," he said to Chris and me. "Come on, guys. Whatever's going on, we need to keep our strength up." Chris looked at his bowl, then at me. I gave a small nod. He was right. We needed food, and we had no real reason to distrust Agnes other than the strangeness of finding her cabin here and my own unease. I took a bite. The stew was indeed delicious, the meat tender and flavorful, though there was an underlying taste I couldn't identify, something gamey and wild. As we ate, Agnes asked about our hike, nodding sympathetically as we described getting lost in the fog. She didn't seem surprised or particularly concerned, which struck me as odd, given how harrowing our experience had been. "The mountains can play tricks on the mind," she said, refilling Nate's bowl without being asked. "Especially these mountains. They have history." "What kind of history?" Chris asked. Agnes's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "Old history. Before my time, before anyone's time. The native people of this region had many stories about these peaks. They believed certain areas were thin places, where the barrier between our world and others wasn't as solid." "Like the Bermuda Triangle?" Devin asked with a nervous laugh. "Something like that," Agnes agreed. "They told stories of a spirit that lived in the highest reaches, a spirit that had once been human but had committed the greatest taboo and consumed human flesh during a terrible winter. It transformed into something else, something always hungry, always hunting." "The Wendigo," I said quietly, remembering Devin's trance-like state on the mountainside. Agnes's gaze snapped to me, sharper than before. "Yes, that's one name for it. You know the legends?" "Just what I've heard," I said, suddenly wishing I hadn't spoken. "Fascinating creatures," Agnes continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded me uncomfortably of the humming we'd heard. "Neither fully spirit nor fully flesh. They can possess the weak-minded, speak through them. And they're cunning hunters. They can mimic human voices, lure their prey right to them." Her eyes moved to Nate, like a scream for help in the darkness. An uneasy silence fell over the table. I noticed that while Agnes had served herself a bowl of stew, she hadn't eaten a single bite. "I think we should get some rest," Chris said, pushing his half-finished bowl away. "It's been a long day." "Of course," Agnes said, standing. "I've made up beds for you by the fire. You'll be warm and comfortable there." She gestured to 4 pallets arranged near the hearth, each covered with furs and blankets. Like the table that had been set for exactly 4 people, the beds seemed too convenient, as if she had been expecting us all along. "Thank you," Devin said, though I could hear the strain in his voice. "You're very kind to take in strangers like this." "Oh, but we're not strangers, are we?" Agnes said with that same cold smile. "Not anymore. We've broken bread together. In some cultures, that makes us family." None of us knew how to respond to that. Exhaustion was hitting me hard now, a heaviness in my limbs that made it difficult to think clearly. Glancing at the others, I could see they felt it too. Even Chris's vigilant expression was slipping into something more drowsy. "I'll just clean up," Agnes said, gathering our bowls. "You boys get some sleep. We can talk more in the morning." I wanted to resist, to suggest we leave immediately despite the darkness, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I found myself moving toward one of the pallets, sinking down onto it as if my bones had turned to water. Devin, Nate, and Chris did the same, their movements similarly sluggish. "Something's wrong," Chris mumbled, his words slurring slightly. "The food." "Sleep now," Agnes said, her voice seeming to come from very far away. "Everything will be clearer in the morning." I fought to keep my eyes open, to think through the fog descending over my mind, but it was useless. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Agnes standing over us, her form somehow taller and thinner than before, her smile revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. I dreamed of running through endless forests, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel at my back, its hunger reaching out to me like a physical force. I dreamed of mountains that moved, of trails that led nowhere and everywhere at once. I dreamed of Agnes, but she wasn't Agnes anymore. She was something ancient and terrible, wearing human skin that didn't quite fit. And I dreamed of Devin, Nate, and Chris, their bodies broken and empty, their essence consumed by the thing that hunted us. I woke with a strangled gasp, drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. The fire had died down to embers, casting the cabin in deep shadows. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. The hike, getting lost, the strange sounds, the figure in the mist, and finally, Agnes and her too convenient cabin. I sat up, looking around frantically for my friends. Devin and Chris lay on their pallets, still deep in whatever unnatural sleep had claimed us. But Nate's pallet was empty. "Nate?" I whispered, afraid to raise my voice. No answer came. Agnes was nowhere to be seen either. I crawled to Devin, shaking him urgently. Devin, wake up." He stirred, his eyes opening but unfocused. "What?" "Something's wrong. Nate's gone. We need to get out of here." I moved to Chris next, shaking him as well. He came awake more quickly, sitting up with a jolt. "The old woman," he said immediately. "Where is she?" "I don't know. Nate's missing too." Devin was more alert now, glancing around the cabin with growing alarm. "What was in that food? I feel like I've been drugged." "I think we were," I said grimly. "Come on, we need to find Nate and get the hell out of here." We got to our feet, unsteady at first but gaining strength as the effects of whatever had been in the stew wore off. Our packs were piled near the door where we'd left them, seemingly untouched. We grabbed them, along with our jackets and boots. "Should we look for Nate here first?" Devin whispered, gesturing to a door at the back of the cabin that I hadn't noticed earlier. Chris shook his head. "I don't think we want to see what's behind that door. Let's check outside." We slipped out of the cabin into the pre-dawn gloom. The valley looked different in the faint light, less picturesque, more ominous. The trees surrounding it seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a cage-like effect. "Nate!" Devin called softly, his voice barely carrying in the still air. A moan answered him, weak but human, coming from behind the cabin. We hurried around the structure to find Nate sprawled on the ground, his clothing torn and dirty, his face scratched and bleeding. He was conscious but barely, his eyes rolling wildly as we approached. "Nate, what happened?" I knelt beside him, checking for serious injuries. "She, not human," he gasped, his voice raw. "Tried to prepare me." "Prepare you? What do you mean?" Chris asked, helping me lift Nate to a sitting position. "For it, the thing in the mountains. She's its keeper, finds food for it." Nate's eyes focused suddenly, locking onto mine with terrifying intensity. "She was cutting me, small pieces, said it prefers to eat while the meat is still alive." Devin made a choked sound, half gasp, half sob. "We need to go. Now." I nodded, helping Nate to his feet. He could stand but not walk unassisted. Chris took one side, I took the other, and we began moving away from the cabin as quickly as Nate's condition would allow. "Not that way," Nate said as we headed toward the forest. "That's where she went, to call it." "Call what?" Devin asked, though I think we all knew the answer. "The Wendigo," Nate whispered. "Her master, or her husband. I'm not sure she knows the difference anymore." We changed direction, heading for the slope on the opposite side of the valley. Dawn was breaking now, the sky lightening to a pearly gray that did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. "Look," Chris said suddenly, pointing to something on the ground ahead of us. It was a trail, not the wild game path we'd followed down into the valley, but a proper hiking trail with occasional markers. A trail that, by all rights, should not have existed. "Could this lead back to civilization?" Devin asked hopefully. "Only one way to find out," I replied, though every instinct was screaming at me not to trust anything in this place. We followed the trail up the slope, Nate growing stronger with each step until he could walk with just one of us supporting him. The forest we entered at the top was different from the twisted, mossy one we'd fled through the night before. Younger, healthier, with more typical Alaskan vegetation. I think I recognize this," Chris said after we'd been walking for perhaps half an hour. "This looks like the trail we took up to our campsite." He was right. The landmarks were becoming familiar. A distinctive lightning-struck tree, a small stream crossing with flat stones placed as stepping stones, a view of distant peaks that matched what we'd seen on our ascent. "How is this possible?" Devin asked. "We were miles from here, completely lost." "I don't think we were," Chris said slowly. "I think we were being led in circles, made to think we were lost when we weren't." "By Agnes?" I asked. "By whatever Agnes serves," Chris replied. We pushed on, our pace quickening as the trail became more familiar. When we finally caught sight of our campsite, our tents still standing exactly as we'd left them, the relief was so intense I felt my knees go weak. "We made it," Devin breathed, his voice cracking with emotion. "I can't believe we actually made it back." But something was wrong. Though the morning was well advanced now, the air still held an unnatural chill, and an oppressive silence hung over the campsite. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. "Let's grab our stuff and get off this mountain," Chris said, already moving toward his tent. "I don't want to spend another minute here." We followed him, Nate still leaning heavily on my shoulder. As we approached the tents, I noticed something strange about mine. The entrance flap was unzipped, hanging open slightly. "Did we leave the tents open?" I asked, slowing my pace. Devin shook his head. "No way. We always zip up because of bugs and small animals." Chris reached his tent first, hand outstretched to grab his gear. He froze suddenly, his body going rigid. "What's wrong?" I called. When Chris turned back to us, his face was ashen. "Someone's been in our tents." We hurried forward, or as much of a hurry as we could manage with Nate still injured, and saw what Chris had discovered. Our sleeping bags had been slashed to ribbons, our extra clothing strewn about, food containers torn open and emptied. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the interior wall of each tent, written in what looked horribly like dried blood, was a single word: hungry. "We need to go," Devin said, his voice shaking. "Now." "Wait," Chris said, rummaging through the destruction in his tent. "We need to see what supplies we still have. We can't just run off unprepared again." He was right, of course. After a quick inventory, we found that much of our food was gone, but we still had some energy bars and trail mix. Most of our water was untouched. My first aid kit was intact, allowing me to clean and bandage the worst of Nate's cuts. We had enough essential gear to make it back to civilization, if we could find the right trail. "The lake," Nate said as I finished bandaging a deep cut on his forearm. "If we can get back to Eklutna Lake, we can follow the shoreline to the trailhead where we started. There's a ranger station there." "Can you make it that far?" I asked him. He nodded grimly. "I don't have a choice, do I?" We packed what usable supplies remained into 2 backpacks, abandoning the shredded tents and sleeping bags. According to Chris's map, which thankfully had been in his pocket rather than his tent, we were about a 5-hour hike from the lake, assuming we could find and follow the correct trail. "Let's move," Devin said, glancing nervously at the surrounding forest. "I don't want to be up here when it gets dark again." We set off down the trail we'd used for our initial ascent, moving as quickly as Nate's condition would allow. The day was advancing, the sun occasionally breaking through the cloud cover to provide brief moments of warmth and reassurance. But the unnatural silence persisted, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and footsteps. After about an hour of steady descent, Chris, who was leading our group, stopped so suddenly that Devin nearly collided with him. "What's wrong?" Devin asked. Chris pointed to the trail ahead. "Look." What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing directly in our path was a figure, not Agnes this time, but a man. He was tall and thin, dressed in ragged clothing that looked decades out of date. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with sunken eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. And his smile, God, his smile was too wide, displaying far too many teeth. "Hello, boys," the man said, his voice carrying that same strange accent as Agnes. "Leaving so soon? My wife says you never even said goodbye." "Move aside," Chris said, his voice steadier than I would have expected. We're just trying to get back to the trailhead." The man's smile widened impossibly further. "But you can't leave yet. You haven't met the master of these mountains, and it's been so looking forward to meeting you." "We're not interested," Devin said, his hand moving slowly to the bear spray clipped to his belt. The man noticed the movement and laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling together. "That won't help you against what hunts you." "What do you want from us?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I frantically considered our options. "Want? Oh, we don't want anything from you," the man replied with that horrible smile. "We simply provide a service. There are appetites that must be satisfied, ancient hungers, and in return, we are granted certain privileges." "You're insane," Nate said weakly from beside me. "Perhaps," the man conceded with a slight nod, "but I've been enjoying my insanity for over 100 years now. The master is very generous to those who serve it well." That was when I noticed something odd about the man's feet. They didn't quite touch the ground. He stood on the trail before us, but there was a small gap, perhaps half an inch, between his worn boots and the dirt below. Devin had noticed it too. "He's not real," he whispered, "or at least not fully here." The man's grin turned knowing. "Clever boy. Not fully here, not fully there. Caught between, just like my Agnes, just like you'll be, once the master has fed." "We're leaving," Chris said firmly, taking a step forward, "and you're going to let us pass." The man made no move to block our way, but his smile never faltered. "By all means, the trail is open to all. But I should warn you, it may not lead where you think." With that cryptic statement, he stepped aside, gesturing down the trail with a mock bow. We moved forward cautiously, giving him as wide a berth as the narrow trail would allow. As we passed, I could feel the cold radiating from him. Not the chill of mountain air, but something deeper, more primal. The cold of the grave. "Don't look back," Chris whispered once we were past him. "Just keep moving." We quickened our pace as much as possible, the sense of being watched prickling between my shoulder blades. After perhaps a quarter mile, Devin broke the silence. "Is he following us?" Despite Chris's warning, I glanced back. The trail behind us was empty. "I don't see him," I reported, turning back around, and froze. The man was standing directly in front of us again, though we'd just left him far behind. That same terrible smile stretched across his face. "Didn't I mention?" he said conversationally. "The trails here have a way of circling back." Devin didn't hesitate. He drew the bear spray and discharged it directly into the man's face. The effect was not what any of us expected. Instead of recoiling in pain, the man's form seemed to waver, like heat shimmer on a summer road. His features blurred, reformed, then blurred again. His smile never faltered. "Now that," he said, his voice distorting slightly, "was not very hospitable." Chris grabbed my arm. "The trees," he hissed. "We need to get off the trail." Without waiting for a response, he plunged into the forest beside the trail, dragging me with him. Devin and Nate followed close behind. We crashed through underbrush, scrambled over fallen logs, and ducked under low-hanging branches, moving as quickly and erratically as we could manage. "The trail is a trap," Chris gasped as we ran. "That's why we kept going in circles yesterday. The trails don't lead out. They lead deeper in." It made a terrible kind of sense. The fog, the disorienting effects, the GPS malfunction, all designed to keep us lost, to keep us on the mountain. "So how do we get out?" Devin asked, helping Nate over a fallen tree. "We make our own way," Chris replied grimly. "Straight downhill. The lake is at the lowest elevation. If we keep descending, we have to reach it eventually." It was risky. Cross-country travel in mountainous terrain always is, but we had no choice. We continued our desperate flight through the forest, using the slope and Chris's compass to maintain a generally downward and eastward trajectory, toward where the lake should be. The forest grew denser as we descended, making progress increasingly difficult. Thorny underbrush tore at our clothing and skin. Low-hanging branches whipped our faces. Nate was flagging badly, his earlier injuries clearly taking their toll. "We need to rest," I said after we'd been bushwhacking for nearly 2 hours. Chris nodded reluctantly. "Just for a few minutes. We can't afford to lose daylight." We found a small clearing and sank to the ground, all of us breathing hard. I shared out water and the remaining energy bars, though none of us had much appetite. "Do you think we've lost them?" Devin asked, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around us. "I don't know," Chris admitted. "But we need to keep moving. The lake can't be more than a few hours away now if my sense of direction is right." Nate, who had been silent for much of our flight, suddenly spoke up. "They're not pursuing us." We all turned to look at him. His face was pale, his eyes feverish. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They don't need to chase us," Nate said, his voice distant. "They know we can't escape. The mountain itself is their ally." An uncomfortable silence followed his words. I wanted to dismiss them as the product of shock and injury, but after everything we'd experienced, I couldn't. "We should go," Devin said finally, getting to his feet. "Even if Nate's right, we have to try." We helped Nate up and continued our descent. The forest began to thin slightly, allowing us to move more easily but also exposing us more. The afternoon was advancing, shadows lengthening around us. The thought of being caught in these woods after dark was unbearable. "Look!" Chris suddenly exclaimed, pointing ahead. "Water." Through the trees, I could see a gleam of blue. Not the lake itself, which would be much larger, but perhaps a stream feeding into it. It was the first encouraging sign we'd had all day. We hurried toward it, renewed hope giving us energy. The stream was small but clear, tumbling down the mountainside in a series of small waterfalls and pools. "If we follow this downstream, it should lead us to the lake," Chris said, consulting his map. "Water always flows downhill." It seemed like a solid plan, until the humming started again, echoing off the rocky streambed and surrounding trees. That same eerie, not quite musical sound we'd heard on our first night on the mountain. "No," Devin whispered, his face draining of color. "Not again." The humming grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And with it came a mist. Not the natural fog of the mountains, but something that moved against the wind, curling and twisting with purpose. "Run!" Chris shouted, abandoning any pretense of caution. "Follow the stream." We ran, slipping on wet rocks, splashing through shallow pools, the streambed providing a clearer path than the tangled forest. The mist pursued us, tendrils of it reaching out like grasping hands. The humming built to a crescendo that set my teeth on edge and made my vision blur. Ahead, the stream disappeared over a larger waterfall, perhaps 20 feet high. We skidded to a halt at the edge, staring down at the rocky pool below. "We have to jump," Devin said, eyeing the distance. "Nate can't make that," I objected. "Not in his condition." "We don't have a choice," Chris said, looking back at the advancing mist. Within it, I could now make out shapes, tall, impossibly thin figures moving with fluid, inhuman grace. "I can make it," Nate insisted, though he could barely stand without support. "We'll go together," I told him. "On 3. 1, 2. Before I could say 3, the ground beneath Nate's feet crumbled away. With a startled cry, he pitched forward over the edge of the waterfall. I lunged for him, managing to grab his jacket, but the sudden weight pulled me forward as well. I heard Devin and Chris shout as both Nate and I plummeted toward the pool below. The impact drove the breath from my lungs. The water was shockingly cold, the current stronger than it had appeared from above. I surfaced, gasping, looking frantically for Nate. He was a few yards away, struggling weakly against the flow. I swam to him, got an arm around his chest, and fought to keep both our heads above water as the current carried us downstream. Behind us, I heard splashes. Devin and Chris had jumped in as well, either by choice or necessity. The stream widened, its flow becoming less turbulent. As we rounded a bend, I caught a glimpse of something through the trees that made my heart leap. The vast blue expanse of Eklutna Lake. "We're almost there," I shouted to Nate, who was barely conscious in my grip. "Hold on." The stream carried us into a final pool before emptying into the lake itself. I managed to drag Nate to the rocky shore, collapsing beside him in exhaustion. Moments later, Devin and Chris staggered from the water, looking as battered and drained as I felt. "We made it," Chris said in disbelief, staring at the lake stretching before us. "We actually made it." "The trailhead," Devin gasped, pointing along the shoreline. "It should be that way, maybe 2 miles." I looked back the way we'd come, half expecting to see the mist and its horrible occupants emerging from the forest. But the trees stood silent and empty in the late afternoon light. The humming had stopped. "Can you walk?" I asked Nate, who was shivering violently next to me. He nodded weakly. "If it means getting out of here, I'll crawl if I have to." We set off along the lakeshore, supporting Nate between us. Every step away from the mountain felt like a victory, every landmark that matched our memories of the hike and a confirmation that we were truly escaping. When we finally saw the wooden structure of the ranger station in the distance, Devin actually let out a sob of relief. We quickened our pace, ignoring our exhaustion, drawn to that symbol of safety and civilization like moths to a flame. The ranger on duty, a stocky woman named Peterson according to her nameplate, looked up in shock as we stumbled through the door, soaking wet, covered in scratches and bruises, with Nate barely conscious between us. "What happened to you guys?" she demanded, already reaching for a first aid kit and her radio. "We got lost," Chris said simply. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. How could we possibly explain what had really happened? Ranger Peterson called for medical assistance while helping us tend to Nate's injuries, which looked even worse in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the station. The cuts on his arms and torso were deep and strangely patterned, deliberate rather than accidental. "What did this?" Peterson asked, examining one particularly nasty wound. "Animal attack," Nate mumbled, the lie coming easily. "Didn't see what it was." Peterson looked skeptical but didn't press the issue. "The ambulance will be here in 20 minutes. You're lucky. Another day out there in your condition, and we might have been organizing a recovery mission instead of a rescue." While we waited for the ambulance, I found myself drawn to the window, staring back at the mountains we'd fled. The evening light cast them in purple shadow, making them look magnificent and peaceful, nothing like the nightmarish landscape we'd experienced. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Peterson said, coming to stand beside me. "But dangerous if you don't respect them. Have you ever heard of—" I hesitated, unsure how to phrase it without sounding crazy. "Are there any local legends about the Chugach? About things in the mountains?" Peterson gave me a curious look. "You mean like the Nantina?" "I don't know what that is," I admitted. "It's what some of the local Dena'ina people call it. Their version of what other tribes might call a Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and winter." She shrugged. "Every wilderness has its monsters. Most are just stories." "Most?" I asked. Peterson's expression grew more serious. "I've been a ranger here for 15 years. I've seen things I can't explain. Areas where technology fails for no reason. Hikers who swear they've been walking in a straight line for hours only to end up exactly where they started. And there've been disappearances. Hikers who set out and never return. Like Agnes and her husband?" The name slipped out before I could stop myself. Peterson's head snapped toward me, her eyes suddenly intent. "How do you know those names?" I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothing. "You know them." "Agnes and Frederick Blackwood. They were reported missing in 1974. Their cabin was found abandoned. Meals still on the table, beds made, but no sign of the owners. It was one of the area's most famous disappearances." Peterson studied my face. "Their cabin was near Eagle Peak, where you boys were hiking." Before I could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle announced the arrival of the ambulance. Peterson gave me one last searching look before turning to help the paramedics with Nate. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, police questions, and finally, a hotel room in Anchorage where the four of us collapsed into dreamless exhaustion. We'd given the authorities a sanitized version of events. We got lost in bad weather, Nate was injured in a fall, we found our way back after a harrowing night in the wilderness. They seemed to accept our story, though I caught a few skeptical glances at the precision of Nate's wounds. We flew home 2 days later, all of us still jumpy, still glancing over our shoulders at shadows. Nate's physical wounds would heal, but I could tell by the distant look in his eyes that other scars would remain. On our last night in Alaska, the four of us sat in Devon's hotel room, none of us willing to be alone with our thoughts. We hadn't really talked about what happened, not the full extent of it. It hung between us, unspoken but omnipresent. I looked up Agnes and Frederick Blackwood, Chris said suddenly, breaking the long silence. They were real people. They lived in a remote cabin in the Chugach Range. Like the ranger said, they disappeared in 1974. No bodies were ever found. So who was? Devon struggled to find words. I don't know, Chris admitted. Maybe echoes. Maybe something else wearing their forms. What about the thing in the mist? I asked. The Wendigo, or Nantina, or whatever it was. No one answered. Some questions are better left unasked. We're never going back there, right? Nate said, his first words all evening. Promise me. None of us ever goes back. We promised. It was an easy vow to make. That was 2 months ago. I still dream about it almost every night. The mist, the cabin, Agnes's too wide smile. I wake up gasping, convinced I can hear that eerie humming outside my window. Devon, Chris, and I talk regularly, checking in on each other, reassuring ourselves that we're safe, that we're home, that it's over. Nate has withdrawn, rarely responding to messages, declining invitations to meet. I worry about him but try to respect his need for space. Last week, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a carved wooden figure, crude but recognizable as a tall, emaciated human form with too many teeth. And a note, written in spidery handwriting. The mountain remembers you. The hunger never ends. I burned the figure and the note. I told myself it was just a cruel prank, someone who'd heard rumors of our ordeal. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment at night, I catch myself listening for that humming. And sometimes, like now, as I write this, I swear I can hear it. Faint but unmistakable, coming closer with each passing day. The hunger never ends, and I'm afraid that sooner or later it will find us again.